Thank you all for joining us so much. This afternoon is sort of the crowning event in a week with our visionary in residence, Trevor Hart. Trevor Hart was the co-founder of the Institute for Theology, Imagination, and the Arts at the University of St. Andrews in St. Andrews, Scotland. Trevor, about 15 years ago? Is that about? Yeah. And was my doctoral supervisor. I studied there at IDEA and is a dear, dear friend. He's one of really the top 2 or 3 or 4 voices in the world talking at the intersection of theology, imagination, and the arts. He's a theoretician. He's trained as a systematic theologian who entered in more and more to the role of the imagination in human knowing and human experience of the world. But he's also proven this week to be a consummate conversationalist and interlocutor. And one of the things one of the art professors said yesterday, I think his quote was, "You have been the most generous guest we've ever had here." And I'd second that. One of the ways that Trevor's done that so well is that he has listened attentively all week long to artists, to practitioners. So he isn't just interested in going back and forth, batting around theories, authors, citations. He wants to hear from artists about the art they make. He wants to listen long. In fact, one of his core convictions is that theology does well in attending to the arts, that the arts aren't merely an ornamentation for theology, but themselves might fund the project of theology, that the arts might themselves provoke new questions for theology, even be, in a certain sense, sources for theology. I've watched my artist friends have a look that combines relief and gratitude and joy all at once. So suspicious that, like so many Christians in the church, maybe so many theologians, that the minute a theologian enters into this conversation, he's going to survey the territory, reassert that theology is the queen of the sciences and that people need to bow down quickly. I think we can speak of the appropriately disciplinary nature of theology, that is, the discipline in which we attend to who God is for us in Christ. We can speak to that and at the same time have an incredibly generous, receptive posture towards, in particular, the arts. And Trevor lives that so well. All this being said, he's in a funny career moment where he's transitioned to a parish. He's left the academy. He's left the world of theoreticians for the world of Christian practicing, to be amongst people in the pews who are daily, day in and day out, seeking to live the Christian life well. So he's at a very unique transition point as a thinker, and as he does a lot of work in the nature of imagining. One of his core commitments in his work is that we are imaginative animals, that all of our thinking and experiencing and doing and speaking is caught up with the imagination. I think this is the 3rd time I've thought of this metaphor, but it fits again, caught up. Yeah, you didn't realize it, and I had forgot about it too, but all of a sudden I'm using a metaphor that brings together this sense of gathering and moving upward when things are caught up. So already in my thinking, in my doing this academic thing before you, I'm imagining, and I'm inviting you to imagine with me. And Trevor's work everywhere shows how the imagination is shot through our experience, how we know, how we relate, how we speak of God, how we speak of one another. So I'm very excited to welcome you to the symposium this afternoon. We'll hear a plenary lecture from Trevor Hart. Then we'll have a lecture from Bill Dyrness. I'll introduce Bill in a few moments, but we're so glad to have him here as well from Fuller Seminary. We'll have a short break after that, and then we'll hear from 5 people who we've asked to respond to a brief prompt about the nature of making good, which is what we're entitling the symposium. And then we'll end with some time of conversation at the end. So to begin with, let me introduce to you Trevor Hart and his paper, Unauthorized Texts, Theology in Another Mode. Trevor.
I was going to say, can everybody hear me? But I think actually that goes without saying. Can I just say before I say a little bit about my paper this afternoon, how much I've enjoyed being here this week and how grateful I am to Matt and to Melissa and to everybody else involved for hosting that, and to people for taking the trouble, and I don't doubt that it was trouble, to read some of the things I've written, and then to engage with them, with me so constructively. It's not that often that as an academic you get the opportunity to have people take so seriously so much of what you've done. and to engage with them in conversation. So it's been great fun, and I've really enjoyed it. So thank you. This presentation is by way of an academic presentation, so to some extent I'm slipping back into the theory mode, but it's grappling with the question about whether or not theology in some sense can be done in a mode other than that which for years enough I've practiced it, that's to say as a sort of systematic dogmatician working analytically and philosophically, whether theology can also be done in other ways, and chiefly in this case through works of creative imagination. So I'll launch straight in. I've got two main sections. The first is a sort of general introduction to that question, and then the second I want to attend in particular to John Milton's Paradise Lost, which I hope some of you at least will be familiar with. And forgive me if I don't spend too long outlining the content of that. I'm going to presume a certain amount of familiarity with the basics of that poem and just dive straight into it when we get there. So first of all then, theology, faith and fictions. As I've said, my concern this afternoon is going to be with the suggestion that certain works of literature might properly function as texts of theology. Texts, that is to say, that engage and wrestle with and deepen our grasp upon the realities with which religion and doctrine, in its way, has properly and inevitably to do. When we consider the texts that lie at the centre and the fount of Christian theology, scriptural texts, the substance of what we find there certainly encourages rather than discourages the suggestion that Christian faith itself is a sort of soliciting from us of considerable acts of imagination from first to last. Not only is the literary genre of much of the Christian canon of a sort that makes explicit appeal to our imagination first, parables, stories, poetry, saga, apocalypse, proverbs, and so on, and only thereby to our powers of intellectual judgment and our effective responses, Jesus' own ministry of teaching and preaching and healing and sign-giving was, from all that we know of it anyway, one that drew men and women into discipleship and left some others cold, by a continual and sustained appeal to their powers of imagination. Forgive me if I talk funnily at the moment. It sounds a bit like I'm speaking to a tin box, but anyway, as long as you can hear me, that's fine. How then shall we picture the kingdom of God is probably sufficient dominical mandate for taking the religious and theological importance of the imaginative life thoroughly seriously, and for considering an understanding of God's revealing of himself to us as a continual divine bid by the Spirit to take our imagination captive, to compel us to see and to hear, to feel and to taste the world in a wholly new manner, and to respond accordingly. In the first chapter of a book that I published recently, that some of you have looked at bits of, Between the Image and the Word, I've argued that theology, which is predicated upon and part of that same imaginative response, is always and necessarily engaged with images of one sort or another, and so with the operations and the outputs of human imagination, albeit ones divinely inspired and divinely sanctioned. It remains true, nevertheless, that imagination works in different ways, and it produces quite different sorts of outputs. And this observation might occasion a potential objection, I suppose, to the claim that works of literary imagination could function as texts of theology. Surely, it might be argued, the nature of literature is playful, it's open-ended, eschewing the moral demand to provide an authentic or a true account of any circumstance, and prone thereby to muddy the waters of reality, rather than lending itself naturally to a clear and concise analysis and accounting of the sort that theology, in the interest of helping faith better to understand itself, typically seeks. This criticism, though, I think can be turned promptly on its head. Just as imagination can and does do more than one sort of thing, so too, I want to suggest, theology, in its turn, is patient of more than one mode of working and one sort of outcome. And far from open-textured, technically uncommitted nature of literary imagination being a fatal flaw, for some theological purposes, it seems to me, it presents itself rather as a potential virtue. It might help perhaps if we differentiate at this point between theology on the one hand and doctrine on the other. For convenience, let's define doctrine as the attempt to clarify, to offer a cogent statement of what the church believes and has classically believed across the centuries. Now, that's a vital intellectual task. And while for all the reasons I've just rehearsed, it can and will hardly be one entirely free from the contributions of imagination, its modus operandi will typically be one that seeks to delimit things, to define them, to close questions down and come up with answers. Of course, there may still be differences of perspective to be had, even disagreements to be lived with, different doctrines of the person of Christ, of the Spirit, of the church, and so on. But insofar as each of those is concerned with formulating, as clearly as the intrinsic mystery of faith's object permits, formulating what can and should be confessed in relation to various articles of faith, each shares the doctrinal imperative of stating that mystery and doing so in a manner that helps Christian preaching and teaching in its faithful rendering of the story of God's dealings with the world. Understood in that way, doctrine is obviously a form of theology, of thinking and speaking clearly about God. But it's not the only form. Theology needs to be willing to ask questions, to interrogate, to open up, to explore the entailments of what's given to it in Revelation, to consider different possibilities, and to ask uncomfortable questions and adopt alien standpoints, precisely in order better to understand its own perspectives. It needs to do this continually, returning afresh to hear the words spoken to it from beyond, rather than resting content with the mere transmission and translation of an agreed set of formulae, simply recycling the answers given by yesterday's theologians. Furthermore, precisely in faithfulness to what it believes itself to know of God, that this God is an ultimate mystery, otherwise unknowable, remaining veiled even in the midst of being revealed. Because of what it believes about this God, theology must reckon with the shortfall of meaning and the excess of meaning in all its statements about God, and never suppose for a moment that it has its object pinned down, trussed up for easy inspection and definition. The English theologian Paul Fides puts the matter very helpfully. There is, he suggests, on the one hand, a vital movement from mystery to us in Revelation, as God seizes our language and therefore places us under an obligation in turn to speak of him and to speak as clearly as we can about him. But, he says, Fides says, there's also a perfectly proper and actually a theologically vital movement from the side of human reflection towards mystery, as our response to Revelation takes the form not just of fixing and determining meaning, but forever seeking to interrogate and to immerse ourselves imaginatively in its fertile excess afresh, unafraid of becoming lost, precisely because we trust the one who holds us and will not let us go. As Fides suggests, both of these impulses are necessary, and they have to be sustained in a constant constructive dialogue if theology is not to lapse either into an amorphous flux of images in which anything goes, uncertain what it believes or why, or, on the other hand, to wither into an arid dogmatism long since drained of vital contact with the living mystery of faith itself. So I want now to turn to consider just one example of how this might work and what it might look like. And of course, one could look at all sorts of different literary texts from the tradition of Christian writing. But the example I'm going to take is one, as I say, I hope will be familiar to you, at least in broad terms, and that's John Milton's epic poem, Paradise Lost. So, my second heading, in case headings are things that you find useful. I do, because at least then I know where I am in the course of a lecture and how long I've got to go. My second heading is Poetry and Theology in Paradise Lost. In his 1925 study, Milton, man and thinker, Dyrness Sorat urged upon his readers the importance of the attempt to, quote, disentangle from theological rubbish the permanent human interest of Milton's thought, unquote. The thought here is the familiar modern one that what really matters in poetry as elsewhere transcends the accidents of time and place and particular theological commitment, and can only be had by a painstaking process of stripping those away to get at the real, shared, generic core of the poet's experience. In his book Preface to Paradise Lost, published in 1942, C.S. Lewis responded in typically forthright and colourful fashion that this was somewhat like asking us to study centipedes when free of their irrelevant legs, or Gothic architecture without the pointed arches. Somehow, the very point of the matter has been missed, or at least wantonly denied. Milton's thought, Lewis says, when purged of its theology, does not exist. Much more recently, Theo Hobson, another Milton scholar, has laid an analogous charge at the door of post-romantic approaches to Milton's poetry as literature, which regularly laud Milton as a poet, a great poet, and yet assess his worth as such without reference to the ideas, which on another view of the matter appear to be the very lifeblood of his poetry itself. This, Hobson suggests, is like celebrating Jesus as a great teacher, a great moral teacher. The judgment itself isn't false, but it hardly scratches the surface of what really matters about Jesus' teachings. As a pre-romantic, Milton himself wouldn't have recognized the point of a tribute to his or anybody else's poetry in terms of its aesthetic and literary aspects alone. Of course, he understood perfectly well that poetry was gratuitous, beyond any utility it might also possess. Indeed, as Frank Kermode notes, quote, from all that Milton says about the way poetry works, it's clear that he asks of it not that it should immediately instruct, but that it should immediately delight, unquote. It's also true enough that, quote, Milton wrote a theological treatise, but Paradise Lost is not it, unquote. Another quote from Kermode. De Doctrina Christiana, in effect, a work of systematic theology, was composed over several decades and probably completed at the end of the 1650s, just 7 years before the publication of Paradise Lost. But the aestheticist notion of an art produced for art's sake was quite unknown in Milton's day, and the words of poetry mattered for much more than their music alone. In an early anti-prelatical tract, that's a tract directed against bishops in the Church of England, the church that I belonged to, I'm now an Episcopalian in Scotland, as described colourfully by, its bishops were colourfully described by someone I know as the bland leading the bland. Milton didn't like bishops either, so he wrote tracts against prelates, against bishops. And in one of these, he articulates a vision of the poet as one uniquely gifted by the Spirit to gauge the truths, the verities of human life under God. And by showing them forth in ways sufficient to capture the popular imagination, transform the conditions of personal and public life alike. Instruction and delight, Milton obviously believed, could and should interpenetrate. And in this sense, the poet could and must properly be a theologian too. Milton's poetry issues from and it situates itself explicitly within a particular intellectual, practical, and affective world, that of Christian faith in the early modern period. This was, William Poole, another Milton scholar, there's plenty of them, William Poole observes, a period when the narrative center of gravity of Paradise Lost, which is, of course, Genesis 3, when that narrative and doctrinal constructs attendant upon it were at the very forefront of public consciousness and theological conversation. Among Protestant variations on Augustinianism, differing perspectives on the doctrines of grace, freedom, foreknowledge, and the divine decree were bandied around as convenient markers of party allegiance. What you thought about those things defined who you were and where you belonged on the Christian spectrum. And all this came to a head conveniently in contested readings. I've lost my place. There we are. All this came to a head in contested readings of this particular text, Genesis 3. Why did Adam do what he did? Was it his fault? Was it God's fault? Was it the serpent's fault? Was it Eve's fault? All of the above? It's one of those multiple choice questions you get in an exam paper. Well, this, of course, is an interesting religious and theological question. But in an age when religious and political visions were more difficult to disentangle than they sometimes are today, in theory at least, the exegesis of biblical texts both informed and was in turn informed by the realities of public life. And a question about the conditions of Adam's fall was naturally understood in Milton's day to be a question about what human beings are really like when push comes to shove, and consequently, how human societies might most appropriately be ordered for the common good. For Milton and his contemporaries, the true context for human action could really only be understood through an imaginative grasp of a profoundly theological vision of reality, a vision of the precise sort that Milton himself offers in Paradise Lost. Certain questions in particular exercise Milton throughout his life. You can read the biographies, this comes up again and again, especially those to do with human liberty and the questions under which it might be meaningfully exercised in a moral way. So in his 1644 work, Areopagitica, you have to say that like taking a hurdle, otherwise Areopagitica, otherwise you trip over and stumble halfway through it. In Areopagitica, attacking Parliament's efforts to curb the freedom of the press, we find Milton saying the following: if every action which is good or evil in man at ripe years were to be under pittance and prescription and compulsion, what were virtue but a name? What praise could be then due to well-doing? What gramercy to be sober, just, or content? Many there be that complain of divine providence for suffering Adam to transgress. Foolish tongues. I always think it's a great phrase to put on the end of an essay, except it doesn't really work on an essay. Foolish tongues. Good put down. When God gave Adam reason, he gave him freedom, says Milton. Freedom to choose, for reason is but choosing. He had been else a mere artificial Adam, such an Adam as he is in the motions. Assuredly, he says, we bring not innocence into the world, we bring impurity much rather. That which purifies us is trial, and trial is by what is contrary. Temptation, in other words, Milton's saying, is the necessary condition not only for sin, but for its opposite too, obedience and the cultivation of true virtue. Goodness which never has to grapple with evil, either because its choices are coerced or because the opportunities for evil have somehow been carefully airbrushed out of the world. That sort of goodness is bound only to be a shallow and morally sickly thing. And the establishment of good in places of evil impulses in human lives lies only through victories in battle rather than strategies of constant retreat. If then we would truly be delivered from evil, Milton is suggesting, it can only be because we have first been led into or exposed to temptation. And it's this, he muses, that justifies the high providence of God, who, though he command us temperance, justice, continence, yet powers out before us, even to a profuseness, all desirable things, and gives us minds that can wander beyond all limit and satiety. There we go, another word that I trip over. Now, another 2 decades would pass after the publication of that text before the publication of Milton's more famous attempt to justify the ways of God to men. But the theological and the political themes explored poetically in Paradise Lost are here already clearly on the table. Milton then was immersed to the hilt, as we would say today, in the political theology of his generation, and we can't glibly brush that practical, intellectual, fiduciary context aside in consideration of purely aesthetic notions. The beliefs, the ideas, are absolutely essential to the way the poem works as a poem, fusing the concerns of heart, mind, and will together in an imaginative vision which challenges and reshapes our thinking, but not just our thinking. In Lewis's phrase, our total response to the world is turned around by what Milton shows us. I have a subheading here for those who like subheadings, and it's a citation from the text. Forewarned, or seduced to foul revolt? Query. Let me pause for a second to grab some water. Forewarned or seduced to foul revolt. If, as I've suggested, it's important to approach Paradise Lost as a text that's concerned to instruct as well as to delight its readers, it's equally important to ask about the precise manner in which this instruction is duly delivered. By its very nature, as we've already noted, the voice of poetry is generally more elusive, more indirect than that of manuals of doctrine, demanding a far higher level, therefore, of interpretation. To misidentify or to mishear the voice of the poem is to jeopardize the broad shape of the learning and the teaching process which the poet hopes to set in motion. How then in Paradise Lost should we think of Milton, placing himself, or rather the voice of his poem, and his readers vis-a-vis the received theological orthodoxies of his day? His poem, like many poems, contains more than one voice, many voices in fact. And in the nature of the case, they articulate many different perspectives, perspectives which often stand in stark contradiction to one another. The poem could hardly contain the drama that it does otherwise, drama being largely a matter of the careful generation and subsequent resolution of conflicts. But where, amidst all this complicated play of locution, are we to identify the singular word of the poem itself speaking to us? And since Milton deliberately casts his epic within the context of prayer, transforming Homer and Virgil's appeal to the muse into an invocation of the Spirit of God, where should we listen for the poetically mediated Word of God? I want next briefly to identify 4 recent literary critical answers to that question, before turning to a theological issue that lies right at the heart of the poem's treatment of Genesis 3, and then considering that issue in the light of these different critical readings. On the basis of that, I will end, that's the phrase you all wanted to hear, I will end by proposing that a 5th way of reading the poem might actually need to be entertained. First, according to one tradition, notoriously pioneered by Blake and Shelley, and subsequently developed by William Empson and others, Milton's poetry must finally be judged heterodox in its theological achievements, whether he intended it that way or not. So, in Plate 6 of The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, from 1790, William Blake suggests that, quote, Milton wrote in fetters when he wrote of angels and God, and at liberty when of devils and hell, because he was a true poet and of the devil's party without knowing it. In brief, according to this reading, the character of Satan comes out of the whole thing, on the whole rather better than God does, in moral terms. And the reader quickly finds him or herself imaginatively and sympathetically identifying with Satan and with the rebellion that constitutes the first fall in the poem. Of course, the official voice of the narrator and some other voices, those of God himself, those of the Archangel Raphael, these offer damning perspectives on all this, as Milton perhaps realized that his poetic creation was a bit running away with him a bit and sought to turn things around. But it's too late, Blake is saying. The damage has been done, and we, together with our poetic recruiting agent, find ourselves, too, to be of Satan's party, drawn in, sympathetic to the devilish perspective on God and the world. Secondly, a view directly opposed to this is championed by C.S. Lewis, according to whom Milton's account of the fall and all that surrounds the fall is straightforward for those with eyes to see, and Lewis says is substantially that of St. Augustine, which is that of the church as a whole, unquote. Like most other pre-Romantic poets, Lewis suggests Milton was perfectly content to give a clear lead on matters of spiritual and moral concern. He was the sort of omniscient narrator who told you how to see things in the poem and in the world, evoking stock responses, says Lewis, among his readers. In this case, responses tutored by a Vincentian Catholic consensus of faith, stretching all the way back through the centuries, and so contributing directly to the formation and the preparation of human character to meet life's challenges and opportunities. That's what Milton is trying to do, Lewis is telling us. Of course, he admits there are conflicting voices in the poem, but the discerning reader sees quickly through those evil characters, and takes a stand with the overwhelmingly Christian perspective of the poetic consensus, the narrator's voice. Milton, Lewis suggests, manipulates his readers unashamedly, rather than allowing them to make up their own minds, or to wander too far off the beaten track imaginatively. And he does so in the unashamed interest of Christian formation. Thirdly, in his book Surprised by Sin, Stanley Fish builds on Lewis's identification of a subtle manipulation of the reader by Milton, but he takes it in a rather different direction. Rather than holding the reader by the hand, as it were, what Milton does, according to Fish, is to dump the reader down unceremoniously in the imaginative world of his poetic creation itself and leave him there, withdrawing the benefit of narratorial omniscience, setting him up to be seduced by the very same voices and the same alluring options that eventually will lead Eve and Adam themselves into disobedience. So yes, we do find ourselves seduced by Satan's allure, at least at first. And when Adam falls, we're sympathetic to his choice, and we would follow him. But in the moment that we fall in that way, imaginatively, the authoritative voice of the poem rebukes us and calls us into account. The intent of all this, Fish suggests, isn't sheer sadism or harassment of the reader, caught up in the poetic action simply than taught by it. There's that metaphor again. Caught up in the poetic action and the drama, rather than simply informed or instructed by it. We find and discover the dark truth about ourselves and emerge from the encounter, which occurs more than once in the poem as we fail to learn the relevant lesson. In other words, we stumble imaginatively on several occasions and catch ourselves doing it, catch ourselves sympathetic at a point where we ought not to be. Through this repeated encounter, we find ourselves chastened and penitent. In a sense, Fisher's Milton is a supralapsarian deity who leads his readers into temptation precisely in order to deliver them from evil. A suggestion, a suggestion which echoes ideas we've already identified in Milton's earlier musings and which is relevant to the poem's own larger theological understanding. There can only be obedience, there can only be sanctification when one is led into temptation and forced to struggle. That's Milton's political conviction, his moral conviction, and Fish is saying it's the device he uses here poetically. Fourthly, and finally, in these four critical takes on the question of how Milton does his thing. Fourthly, in Milton and the idea of the fall, William Poole suggests that a compromising of dogmatic orthodoxy occurs in the poem, together with an unresolved conflict of perspectives. And these are all due, he argues, to the demands of the narrative genre itself. Precisely by seeking to do what Genesis 3 itself never seeks to do, that is, to offer a convincing, a psychologically, emotionally, humanly convincing narrative account of the commission of the first sin, Milton finds himself compelled to break company with the mainstream dogmatic tradition. For this tradition, Adam and Eve were, in their prelapsarian state, regal and exalted creatures, unperturbed by anything, easily able to send Satan packing had they chosen to do so. Milton's poem, Poole observes, offers just a vision with one hand, but then it withdraws it with the other, portraying the paradisal couple at various points as frail and vulnerable, easy prey to Satan's machinations. Such inconsistency, he argues, albeit theologically problematic, is poetically vital, since in narrative terms there has to be a struggle before capitulation. And so there has to be some indeterminate state leading up to and accounting for the bad action that follows. Narrative is, after all, a matter of situating events in some meaningful and persuasive order. That's what a good story does, ultimately. And the sheer anomaly, or surd occurrence, sits ill with the aesthetic demands of narrative. So, an Adam and Eve who were perfect, completely unscathed by Satan's temptations, who then suddenly sin, makes no narrative sense. So Poole says Milton, for that reason, has to build in this element of frailty, vulnerability, weakness, before the fall, not after it. Paul's observation provokes an important question. Might the existence of conflicting and unresolved voices here in Milton's poem in fact be driven not, as Paul suggests, by poetic considerations, dramatic considerations alone, but by distinctly theological considerations as well? Could such deliberate lack of resolution, in certain circumstances, be more a matter of theological integrity than doctrinal compromise? Might poetry, indeed, be supposed to provide a mode of engagement with certain questions better suited to their exploration than approaches which tend too soon and inevitably towards the production of a neat, systematic unity? Bearing that question in mind, I want to turn now, briefly, to consider the poem's treatment of the question that echoes through it from end to end. How, in the good purposes of God, was it ever possible for sin and sin's progeny to enter into the world? So my next subheading is "Sufficient to have stood?" query. According to God's own testimony in Book 3 of Paradise Lost, human beings were created sufficient to have stood, though free to fall. In many ways, the poem constitutes a sustained reflection on the tensions inherent in that terse formulation, and the ways in which it variously illumines and then complicates the dramatic action in Book 9, where the fruit of the forbidden tree is actually plucked and eaten. In what sense sufficient? And in what sense free? And if both sufficient and free, well, whither then the fall? In grappling with that issue, Milton keeps more than one vision of prelapsarian sufficiency identifiably in play. And the question is, why? From one angle, then, Milton's poem follows very closely the mainstream of Augustinian tradition. It presents to us a paradisal couple in full enjoyment of unalloyed felicity, as he puts it, unperturbed by any agitation of the mind, nor pained by any disorder of the body. In full control, in other words, of their passions, their appetites, and their will. These are not the childlike, naive foundlings of later Socinian theology. Human beings sin because they are weak, and the fall was inevitable. They are regal beings, erect and tall, godlike erect, with native honor clad in naked majesty. Unquote. The garden in which God has placed them provides everything they need and much more besides, so that the sole commandment is one, quote, easily obeyed amid the choice of all tastes, else to please their appetite. It's Adam who asks the obvious, relevant question. Can we want obedience, then, to him, or possibly his love desert, who formed us from the dust and placed us here, full to the utmost measure of what bliss human desires can seek or apprehend? It hardly seems possible that disobedience should arise, though we as readers, like God, of course, have the relevant foreknowledge that grants the question powerful dramatic irony. Milton also rules out any suggestion that the first sin might have been born of childlike ignorance rather than willful disobedience. In Book 5, God sends the Archangel Raphael on a diplomatic mission to forewarn Adam in the most explicit of terms that his faithfulness is going to be tried, so rendering inexcusable his actual capitulation when it comes. And finally, the poem disentangles the fall quite explicitly from any predestinarian scheme in which, sub specie aeternitatis, the fall of human beings was as much a matter of God's willing as of Eve and Adam's own, a matter of divine overruling or absolute decree, which even in their freedom they were in no position to resist. Cleverly, Milton makes God here a more than convenient mouthpiece for his own Arminian theological sympathies. At the point of sin, Eve and Adam act undetermined by anything other than their own will, God says. They are, he insists, authors to themselves in all, both what they judge and what they choose. They decreed their own revolt, they ordained their own fall. The weight placed on creaturely freedom with respect to God's purposes is quite breathtaking at points. As Eve leaves Adam for a bit of gardening on her own, the circumstance, electrically charged by both their and our awareness of the impending danger, namely Satan transformed into the body of a snake, slithering through the bushes towards Eve, Adam contributes some dubious cheerleading. God towards thee hath done his part, he says. I'll read that again because it's too good to break it up and I didn't get the page. God towards he hath done his part, do thine. It's almost like the end of a Billy Graham rally, you know. God's done his bit, now it's your turn. So the emphasis is very definitely on the capacity and the freedom to obey or to disobey, without which, of course, for Milton, true obedience couldn't exist at all. And Milton's verdict at this point in the poem seems to be God's own. Whose fault is the fall, and all that follows from it? Whose but man's own, says God. And we seem to be hearing the narrator's voice at the same time. There is, though, another voice in the poem, a very different perspective on the whole matter, and it can't, I think, be dismissed entirely as a seductive perspective that we're expected to entertain, only to be duly rebuked and rescued from it, as both Lewis and Fish suggest. To be sure, it's only from Satan's lips that God's human creatures in the poem are ever described as frail or puny. They're not that. Yet Milton's God himself is finely ambivalent about the precise state in which his human creatures meet Satan's temptation. At one moment, he insists that their sin is one committed with a high hand, like that of the rebellious angels before them. In fact, of course, the really interesting question in Paradise Lost is not why did Adam sin? The really interesting question is why did Satan sin? At one moment, Milton insists that the sin of Adam and Eve is one committed with a high hand, but in the same speech, God admits that there's a vital difference between Adam's sin and that of Satan. Because, he says, the angels by their own suggestion fell, self-tempted, self-depraved. Man falls deceived by the other first. Man, therefore, shall find grace. The other, none. Elsewhere, Satan is likened by the authoritative voice of the narrator to the thief who climbs into God's fold to harm the flock, and to a vulture just waiting to prey on newborn, helpless lambs. In Book 5, Satan assaults Eve first, not in waking reality, but in a dream, seducing her through the organ of fancy or imagination, leading her all the way to the edge of the slippery slope of disobedience, holding the forbidden fruit to her mouth. But the dream, as so often, ends and evaporates before the fatal step is taken. Adam's response on hearing of the dream is to reassure Eve. Don't worry, he tells her, there's nothing culpable about having dreamt about doing it. It's only doing it that's not right, whatever it is. Evil into the mind of God or man, says Adam, may come and go, so unapproved, and leave no spot or blame behind. Well, perhaps. Or perhaps Satan has here driven the screw of temptation in just so far, engaging the imagination in order to prepare the path in heart and mind and will for the final decisive drive in Book 9. Perhaps, in other words, there is here an initial virtual temptation, if not quite a virtual fall, that renders the other one, when it comes, more explicable. Eve has been softened up. The moral ground has been carefully prepared. Man's fall, when it occurs, will, God admits in his divine foreknowledge, be easy. All too easy, in fact. And when the actual fall is narrated very briefly, I mean, there's this 9-book build-up, and it all happens in the space of a few verses, and you sort of feel let down. Is that it? All too easy. When the actual fall comes, what we're offered is a picture of credulous seduction. All trace of solid virtue and sufficiency to stand, quite frankly now seemingly absent. Eve is taken in. Again, Milton has Adam ask the relevant question, although this time from the perspective of fallen humanity rather than pre-fallen. Oh, why did God, creator wise, create at last this novelty on earth, this fair defect of nature? The fair defect refers to his Eve, of course, who falls deceived. A defect, taken in by Satan's seductive lies. But we can translate the question, because what Milton does, moving beyond the dynamics of Genesis 3, with the permission of 1 Timothy 2, verse 14, for those of you who've got Bibles, is to symbolize in the characters of Adam and Eve, respectively, the twin terms of a Kierkegaardian paradox. In other words, one that's not possible ultimately to resolve. Where human freedom's concerned, even unfallen freedom, in a sense we are undeceived and thus fully responsible moral agents, and yet we fall precisely because we are subject to forces that prey upon us from without and from within. Furthermore, with divine foreknowledge and divine permission. Milton's God unashamedly leaves Satan at large to do his own dark designs, he says. And he looks on those designs bear their evil fruit. But he does so precisely so that Satan, enraged, might see how all his malice served but to bring forth ultimate goodness, grace, and mercy. Milton's account of divine providence here in the poem and in his earlier systematic treatise echoes that of his Arminian mentor, Grotius. God is involved in the production of evil in his world inasmuch as he permits it existence, throwing no impediment in the way of natural causes and free agents. And out of its effects, God himself, quote, eventually converts every evil deed into an instrument of good and overcomes evil with good, unquote. So, to conclude, and on Milton's refusal to conclude, which is more interesting. Adam's question in Book 10 of Paradise Lost is really the one asked by Augustine in Book 11 of his literal commentary on Genesis. Why did God not make his human creatures more sufficient to stand than he actually did? Milton's approach to this question through the dramatic devices of epic poetry permits him to leave the relevant tensions open and unresolved in a manner that more systematic theological treatments might not, keeping the ideas of human sufficiency and insufficiency paradoxically in play at the same time, rather than resolving them prematurely in the interests of any overarching logical unity. Now, lazy appeals to mystery can, of course, be an intellectual cop-out in theology as elsewhere. But as I've already suggested, not all appeals to mystery are lazy. And we must take care not to grant the spirit of Procrustes a dangerous foothold by tethering our notions of what counts as due intellectual rigor mistakenly to just one mode of intellectual engagement. Arguably, Milton's open-ended poetic approach is at least faithful to the canonical pattern of biblical thought on this matter, and indeed to the shape of our experience of evil in the world. Neither of them encourages us to dignify sin and its outputs by explaining them and thereby justifying them, ascribing some positive meaning to them within the scheme of things. And whether we judge a higher systematic resolution to be warranted or not, the poetry of Paradise Lost undeniably affords a powerful theological engagement with the realities of human freedom, temptation, and the commission of sin. One that admittedly raises rather than resolves the big questions, but which thereby, I would suggest, charts the relevant territory more rather than less adequately. In the end, Milton, I suppose, points us to Augustine's own answer in the literal commentary, Penes ipsum est. Why did God set things up in this way? God alone knows. But then, while it may seem to us to be a very odd way of proceeding, God, we might reasonably suppose, knows best. Thank you.
Thanks, Trevor. We won't have time for questions now, but there will be plenty of time for conversation and hopefully a few questions later on in the afternoon. I'd like to now introduce to you our second plenary speaker, Bill Dyrness. Bill is professor of theology and culture at Fuller Theological Seminary. There's all sorts of overlap between these two gentlemen's work. One of the things that I find striking and distinctive about Bill's is it's more explicitly a theology of culture throughout his career. So he's thinking about theology of the arts, but it's also in a broader context of what we do when we make culture, how we're to read culture. And there's a significant missional component as well, so a cross-cultural sense there. I appreciate that very much. Also, like Trevor, Bill has this underlying conviction that we are always already imagining. So my first introduction to your work was your book, Reformed Theology and Visual Culture. And the common caricature of Reformed Christians is that they take the prohibition of images in the Scriptures so seriously that they have effectively that they have no aesthetic whatsoever. And Bill shows through very meticulous, patient, thorough work that there is a rich Reformed imagination, even if it's very surprising. And so he's got this sense that it's, even for those of us who are utterly nervous about images, we can't escape the role of the imagination. He's currently working on a theology of cultural wisdom, and his paper today will be reflecting that, and it's called God and Cultural Wisdom. Bill.
Thank you, Matt. It is an honor to be here, to be with my friend Trevor Hart, and be able to have this conversation with all of you. So thank you for inviting me here. In the 5th century of the Christian era, a large Byzantine basilica was built in what is now Side, on the Mediterranean coast of Anatolia in Turkey. Its ruins are still visible in the old part of the city that stretches along the shore. Significantly, it was built, like many medieval churches, over an old pagan temple, this one dedicated to Athena and Apollo. It used the same materials, even parts of the structure that had previously facilitated that ancient worship, and it appropriated the exact space of that worship. I want to propose this image as a metaphor for what I'm going to argue in this paper. This reflects the basic situation we face in culture when we are trying to make good in our culture, which is, I take, the theme of this week. I want to argue that when it comes to shaping the accoutrements of human culture, we never start from scratch. We begin with layers of inheritance, from physical genes to cultural practices and monuments. I want to elaborate this cultural situation by first offering a brief description of the challenges we face in appropriating culture, then providing 2 substantial case studies. These, I want to move back even further than Trevor, to the early and the medieval church, of how Christians before us have negotiated this challenge. And then I want to bring this work in progress to a close. I want to emphasize this is very much a work in progress. I've got us to the Reformation, and now I've got a whole job of work to do to get us up to the modern period. So we always start by working with what is to hand, all the things that we have. It's only God that makes things out of nothing, which is why in the Christian tradition, it was not until the modern period that artists were called creators. We have this idea that we're creators. Previously, if you use that word for human creators, it would have been kind of a blasphemy. Because earlier Christians understand that we start out on our journey laden and gifted with a legacy of multiple cultures and innumerable ancestors. This fostered a sense of humility and gratitude and occasional resentment toward what has been left for us. In any case, it is the terms of their and our cultural calling. But notice how those 5th century Christians in Side confronted this reality. They appropriated not only the space, but the actual materials and structure of the previous temple to shape their place of worship. This makeover resonated with what Gregory the Great would urge on the missionaries among the English a century later. In 597, Pope Gregory the Great sent Augustine a famous letter where Augustine had arrived in Canterbury and with his retinue of 40 monks. And he wrote back and said, "I can't speak their language. I don't know what I'm doing here. Please help me." So Gregory wrote back this famous letter to him. It said this: "The idols of that English race should by no means be destroyed. The temples of the English race should by no means be destroyed, but only the idols among them. Take holy water and sprinkle it on them. Build altars and place relics in them. For if the shrines are well built, it is essential that they should be changed from the worship of devils to the service of the true God. When this people see that their shrines are not destroyed, they will be able to banish error from their hearts and be more ready to come to the places they are familiar with. But now, recognizing and worshiping the true God. So, preserving the outward form was important to Gregory because it was an implicit recognition of the potential of the people's cultural inheritance. But notice that these Christians were not encouraged simply to accept the practices and meanings of these outward forms. The Christian gospel had changed them and changed how they understood these things. For Christians, even certain practices were clearly forbidden, so the idols had to be removed. But other things could be preserved and repurposed. I would propose that the Christian faith in CCCA was inscribed on the ancient space and its practices. These things were overwritten by the Christian faith. Take holy water and sprinkle it on these shrines. Build altars and place relics in them. Make these things, in other words, over into expressions of the Christian faith. I make this argument because I think this notion of cultural appropriation is especially difficult for us American Christians. We don't understand it, let alone accept it. And there are many reasons for this difficulty, but let me just mention two briefly. The first has to do with the unique set of expectations that have arisen in our American context. The American quest for novelty, the unblinking future on the future, the focus on the future, has frequently blinded us to the presence of what I'm calling here our cultural wisdom, the resources that our place and time has bequeathed to us. Our individual and facile sense that we can be anything we want to be has given us a naive belief that we can make what we want of ourselves, and we are alone responsible and the sole proprietors of what we make of ourselves. The truth, of course, is very different. We are always debtors to family, communities, those elders who have shaped us and provided us with tools we use to make something of ourselves. We are debtors to a kind of natural grace which is sometimes called common, but is anything but. The second reason for this difficulty it lies in the larger intellectual history since the Enlightenment. Much of the Enlightenment project, especially in its more radical forms, wanted to cut itself off from its past and make a fresh start because of much of what had gone before, in their view, especially its art and its religion, was seen as inferior in the light of the growing light of reason. As early as 1667, Thomas Sprat, in the History of the Royal Society of London for Improving Natural Knowledge, urged readers to separate the knowledge of nature from the colors of rhetoric and the devices of fancy, or the deceitful deceit of fables. As Malcolm Guite points out, this meant jettisoning most of the wisdom of the ancient world, both Judeo-Christian and classical, which was carried in myth, story, and song. When I finished my previous work called Poetic Theology, I found on the part of some an incomprehension that has given rise to the reflections today. Readers wondered how we might have such a positive view. We might have such a positive view of all we have learned and appropriated from our culture when it all seems to give evidence of the fall of Genesis 3. This is a central theological problem. How is God interested in the potential and value of a created order as we find it? And in this paper, I want to show how it is that in spite of the disordered character of our world, it is still, as John Calvin argued, a theater for the glory of God. Here's my question. How can we understand this theater? As I see it, Christians throughout history have been tempted in two directions. On the one hand, Christians working with a strong prophetic tradition from Scripture have often denounced tendencies in culture, even to the extent of trying to avoid its influence altogether, and form their own safe cultural enclave. These often worry that hiving too closely to our culture will harm us spiritually, and that by appropriating elements of culture, the purity of the gospel will surely be compromised. On the other hand, some Christians have rushed to embrace elements of culture, claiming it, so to speak, for Christ and seeking to use it in the service of ministry or their Christian vocation. These recognize that Christians cannot form themselves into an isolated community that has no relation to the surrounding culture. These often use the lordship of Christ and God's providential care to support their views. These stances might be termed rigorism on the one hand and accommodationism on the other. Both these views, it seems to me, similarly misunderstand how culture works. The one side believes the full impact of the fall is so strong that culture as a whole needs to be either rejected or replaced. Those on the other feel the whole is to be accepted and exploited for the sake of Christ. Seems to me what is missing in both is a realistic sense of our cultural situation and a constructive awareness of what might be made of this, a recognition that we are stewards of resources that reflect, for better or worse, the previous legacy of our generations before us. There'll be two strands, then, to the argument that I make. First, I want to insist on what I call the fact of our cultural situation. Many times, discussions of culture proceeds as though culture was something out there that I study and I want to get to know and that I use. But this is an illusion. We are through and through cultured beings. From the first response to our external environment, we are socialized to respond and act in certain ways. This means that whether we like it or not, we will be immersed in the cultures and the values and the solicitations of the images and the artifacts of our culture. We may attempt to keep our children from reading Harry Potter. We may even succeed. But like it or not, the message of Harry Potter will get through. This, I argue, is the fact of the matter. This is what it means to be cultured creatures. And it is the inevitable starting point of any reflection by Christians on culture. But the second part of my argument is more constructive, and that is to describe the advantages and the challenges of this cultured situation. Because of the way God has put the world together, because of the Spirit's continuing presence in it, what those generations before us and those communities around us have made of creation can be appropriated by Christians. Indeed, initially, this is all we have to work with. To use properly theological language, the cultural situation can be redeemed. In fact, Christians believe that Christ's work of redemption and the gifting of the Spirit have important implications for appropriation of cultural goods. The process of redemption of all things has been signaled and anticipated by the resurrection. As Christ's resurrection was the first fruits that guarantee our own resurrection, even so, the New Testament argues, the natural and cultural situation can also, and indeed will also, one day be renewed. We do not claim that in Christ the renewal of creation is finished. Rather, we must still pray and hope that God's will be done on earth as it is in heaven. But through Christ's death and resurrection, and by the pouring out of the Spirit, we have been given the resources and the hope to work toward the day when Scripture promises culture will perfectly reflect God and God's purposes. Now, I've spoken earlier of the layers of inheritance, and I want to just return to that notion here. In fact, the fact of our cultural situation, as I said, I don't want to make this out to be more simple than it is. This is a complex situation. The reality of our cultured situation is sometimes bewildering pluralism, involving multiple voices and a variety of life worlds. It would be an easy matter if all we had to contend with was Harry Potter. But alongside there, this is the sounds of Latin jazz, the multiple forms of rap music, even Muslim calls to prayer. Moreover, Facebook and YouTube have made these voices available to us all the time, in every place, probably today, even now, while I'm speaking. In other words, we live in a world of contending values and practices that surge around us, wherever in the world we might find ourselves. American Christians, along with their secular neighbors, often respond to this pluralism with alarm, worries about accommodation and rigorism quickly surface. But I want to argue that a more sober analysis of God's providential presence, even in this, and the resources of creation, can lead us to a humble acknowledgement that these voices also contain gifts and opportunities for growth and witness. One final point before I turn briefly to case studies. Note that the Christians in C-Day and in England were not simply to understand the challenges and that the religious practice posed. They were called to do something about it. They were called to make something of that situation. In other words, their challenge was critically one of appropriation than either simple rejection or acceptance. So, the question our culture poses is insistent. What will we make of our cultural inheritance? At the end of the day, we're called, after all, not to be critics, but to be wise and careful disciples who make something on behalf of Christ and by his grace of something we have inherited. For the reality of our cultural situation is inescapable, but by the grace of God, filled with potential. First case study, Christians in classical cultures. When one compares the New Testament with the Old with respect to attitudes toward culture, one fact appears to stand out. The Old Testament seems to make generous use of the cultural wisdom around them, Egyptian, Babylonian, even Greek traditions. While the New Testament, outside of scattered references, as in John's use of Logos or Paul's use of Greek poets on Mars Hill, seems to hold itself aloof from the surrounding culture. C.S. Lewis' assessment could stand for this common assumption, and you're all familiar with it, I think. On the whole, the New Testament seemed, if not hostile, yet unmistakably cold to culture. I think we can still believe culture to be innocent after we've read the New Testament. I cannot see that we are encouraged to think it important. But this assessment ignores a critical fact. The Old Testament materials were composed over more than a millennium, while the New Testament writings were basically composed within a single century. That vast period of time gave the followers of Yahweh ample time to reflect on and appropriate their cultural wisdom. The artifacts, proverbs, and even the craftsmen of surrounding cultures were appropriated to learn and to build the temple that was to glorify God. New Testament writers, by contrast, were barely beginning to take into account the earth-shaking work of Christ when they wrote their letters and Gospels. I think the more proper comparison is not then between the New Testament and the Old Testament, but between the Old Testament and the New Testament as this was subsequently lived out and appropriated by early Christians. These early centuries then would give Christians a comparable time and opportunity to learn from the broader cultural inheritance and to make something of it. In one sense, like the followers of Yahweh, Christians faced a similar challenge with respect to pagan cultures, accepting and adapting what is good while seeking to avoid the contamination of paganism. In other words, the early church had its own version of culture wars that are all too familiar to us. Or did they? I think a convergence of scholarship recently has shown that this picture is untrue, or at least oversimplified, that there was really no culture war in the early church. It's true, a few rigorists insisted that Christians should separate themselves from the surrounding culture. Tertullian in the 6th century famously argued that Jerusalem has nothing to do with Athens. And the Emperor Julian in 362 forbade Christians from teaching Roman classics. These were clearly in the minority. Despite these rigorists, these were the anti-Harry Potter crowd today, it is clear that Christians in general had no trouble accepting and adapting Roman and Greek culture to their purposes. Indeed, this was in the air they breathed. This can be seen in the adaptation of art and architecture and of classical literature and even popular culture. For reasons of time, I'm going to focus here simply on the Christian appropriation of classical literature and popular culture. Virgil was the foundational author of the Roman educational curriculum. Students memorized their Aeneid just as we do our Shakespeare today. Surely, Christians sitting alongside their pagan classmates must have wondered, how do we understand this foundational story? What were they to make of it? From time to time, attempts were made to suppress the story altogether, as I've seen, just as Christians today sometimes seek to suppress the teachings of Darwin. Julian's decree forbidding Christians to explicate or teach Roman classics sought a mental consistency. You can't read one thing and believe another. But just as today, such attempts were doomed from the start. Darwin may be suppressed, but the substance of that message is going to get through. What do we make of it? What were Christians then to make of Virgil? Late 4th and early 5th century Christian poets proposed the answer. They simply rewrote the poet's work. As Mary Carruthers described this process, they took Virgil apart, not in order to obliterate him, nor to ridicule him, but to save him. And the only way to save him was to remember him, relocate him, repattern him into a Christian. And save him they did, for medieval Christians, and for us to read and to enjoy. These Christians, Carruthers argues, inscribed the Christian story on the Aeneid, much like the bit of Egyptian wisdom is repositioned in the book of Proverbs, or the Pantheon in Rome with its new portal and altar is given new associations and new pattern, and just like the Christians in 5th century C-Day. The reference to saving Virgil is not an exaggeration. Alan Cameron, in his magisterial work, has recently shown that far from Christians having to struggle with pagan revivals and continuing pagan influence, it was actually the Christian appropriation of that culture that saved paganism. Cameron refutes the common assumption that Christians struggled with paganism and with current revivals of that age and faith. He says there were no pagan revivals. His argument is that Christians simply took over this culture, including its games, its literature, and repurposed them. He notes that by the early 5th century, the games had mostly lost their religious connotation. And in the process, these Christians kept these alive for later generations. In a review of Cameron's book, Peter Brown notes that these Christians never saw Roman culture as a threat to their faith. The sense of history and language inherited from the deep past of Rome were, in effect, the indigenous faith of the people. In terms I prefer, it was their poetics. It was what gave color and meaning to life. And it was received as a gift of God's goodness. Here, the inescapable of the poetics of a culture comes into play. When rigorists forbade the reading of Virgil, some parents surely complained, how can we learn our Latin without Virgil? When they stipulated that any practice, any image, any writing not clearly Christian had to be given up, the people responded incredulously, what would we do without our circuses, without the theater, without the chariot races in the amphitheater? These things remained vital, Cameron notes, well into the 5th century, and Christian nobles spent their fortunes on them right up to the Gothic wars of the 6th century. These artifacts and their corresponding enthusiasm turned out to be the central elements in the life of cultivated Christians. They could not simply be suppressed. They were not merely evil counterparts to the festivals of the church, as the rigorists claimed. They were the substance of their daily lives, and they were performed by their neighbors and family. Indeed, they were the indispensable elements that Christians used to make a good life for themselves and for their family. Of course, the poetics of this culture had to be rewritten, repatterned, and occasionally supplanted with new practices. What mattered in the end was not the genesis of these things, but what Christians were able to make of them. But in the first instance, this provided the broad common ground on which pagans and Christians could meet. And it provided the common pleasures that both enjoyed together. Nothing to be refused, as Paul argues in 1 Timothy, if they were received with thanksgiving and sanctified with prayer. The point is that Christianity did not provide a new cultural model, but tools to understand, appropriate, and transform what it received. Over the long history of Christians' mostly futile attempts to suppress cultural voices, it's always been the same. They were simply understood in new ways and given previously unknown meanings. And in the process, Christianity saved what was worth saving in the culture. Cameron concludes his magisterial book with these words: Despite the best attempts of Augustine and the other rigorists, the Roman literary tradition played a vital and continuing role in shaping the thought world of Christians, both at that time and in the centuries to come. Now, I want to be clear. Looking back on that process, it's all too easy for us to be critical of the various elements that were appropriated by these early Christians. Too much Neoplatonism, too much humanism, or whatever. Contemporary theologians, and I won't mention any names, have been famously critical of Augustine for his Neoplatonism. Political theorists are critical of the imperial model that Christians adopted. But this simply underlines the limitation inherent in all cultures and the critical perspective provided by our long history and our cultural pluralism. It does not negate the importance of the early Christian achievement. The point is that these Christians took what they had and made it over. They understood that these were gifts to be appropriated and remade into vehicles that could carry them through life. Second case study, medieval Christianity. This early Christian story is not without reference and relevance for the examination of medieval culture, obviously. For it was the substance of this classical culture, its texts, its manuscripts, that were carefully preserved and copied in the many monastic scriptoria during the Middle Ages. But there were other hands at work too, and I want to underline this, preserving these ancient voices. There were often Muslim believers resident in the next great empire that would come to stretch from southern Spain to northern India. In this new context, centuries-old conversations received new accents. Peter Brown, in a review of a recent exhibition of Islamic art in these centuries, described the cultural exchange that was encouraged. Islamic civilization owed much of its richness to continued religious conversations among Muslims, Jews, and Christians. Initially, in other words, Muslim believers found their own voice in conversation with these older traditions of wisdom. Later, they were to return the favor. What we know as the Renaissance in the West and the attendant recovery of ancient philosophy, and Aristotle in particular, is unthinkable apart from the work of these Islamic scholars in preserving these classical sources. Another layer of our cultural heritage. Two figures I mentioned in particular stand out during what is called the early Renaissance. They embody the continuity and the Christian remaking of inherited wisdom. Francis of Assisi and Dante Alighieri. Early in the 13th century, Francis, the son of a noble cloth merchant, received a series of visions that led him to a radical change of life and discipleship. Francis' dramatic response to Christ's call to sell everything and follow me was to have such profound implications for medieval culture and for spirituality up until the present. Interpreters of this saint's life understandably focus on the innovation that Francis represented and the cultural revolution that this represents. And clearly, Francis did open Christianity to the world around, imbued his faith with feeling, and this was to have broad implications for the liturgy and the art of subsequent generations. Typical is Eric Auerbach's assessment of Francis, that he was the first to awaken the dramatic powers of Italian feeling and language. But in a sense, Francis simply developed patterns and themes that were already present in his inherited culture. Growing up, Francis was entranced by the French romances and the stories of King Arthur. In fact, before his conversion, imagining himself as a heroic knight, he embarked on a military adventure that almost came to a disastrous end. When he came to follow the New Testament Jesus, he brought with him these same dedications and romantic passions, repatterning them within his Christian faith. Likewise, the mystical interpretation of the Christian faith which Francis is often identified had an important precedent in the previous century in the person of Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, whose mystical interpretations of Scripture were to become so influential on the Franciscan theologians. But what makes Francis' life so significant is what he was able to do with this cultural wisdom. For it was clearly the reality of a new heroic journey with a new Lord that brought life to these promising voices. They were inscribed with the call to a new poetic discipleship. Even more striking example, of course, is Dante, who stands at the beginning of what we call the humanist movement. These writers and theologians largely inhabiting the many monasteries that based their writing and thinking on ancient sources and put them in the service of the Christian faith. Dante's great Divine Comedy, 1320 or so, in some ways stands out as an isolated literary achievement of the early Renaissance. But in another sense, it is a reworking of the ancient classic of Virgil's Aeneid. In Dante's work, that classical author becomes my master and my guide, leading him through the inferno up to the top of the purgatory before he is handed over to a new guide, Beatrice, who represents the love of Christ and the grace necessary to travel into paradise. As he sets out to follow Virgil in Canto 2 of the Inferno, Dante the pilgrim says to Virgil, "Now go, a single will moves both of us. You are my guide, my governor, my master." Because a single will guided them both, that is, both were expressions of a divine providence, he could follow this ancient writer. Dante believed that whatever truth had been discovered by Virgil came ultimately from God. But Dante's conviction went even further. He believed there was resonance between Virgil's imaginative account and the story of the soul's journey to God that Dante described in the comedy. The figurative shape of one anticipated the structure of the other. If, as Dante believed, the master story of God's love in Christ and the believer's journey to God is rooted in the reality of God's dealing with creation, then gifted people ought to be able to see something of this and record glimpses of that story. There's a further reason why this framework was critical for Dante. During the 12th century, the ancient writers were being recovered and becoming widely known. Even illiterate peasants would have known, sometimes by heart, the story of Virgil. City-states like Siena and Florence came to imagine themselves as true heirs of the great Roman civilization embodied in these ancient classics. That story was their story as well. What's more, they never saw this as conflicting in any way with their conviction that the story of Christ and his death told in Scripture was the master narrative that made sense of all these stories. So in a way, similar to the patristic poets to which we have referred, Dante remembered Virgil. He relocated him in the form of a Christian account of the soul's journey to God. For Virgil, along with the other voices represented in the inherited cultural wisdom of his time, Ovid, Statius, even Homer, appear alongside the many voices from Scripture. In the 27th canto of each of the canticles, Dante references the famous journey of Ulysses recorded in Homer's Odyssey. In contrast to that hero's mad course, Dante's counter journey is a pilgrimage to God. It fulfills Ulysses' quest, even as it satisfies the lure that nature or art has fashioned and which moved Ulysses to take that journey. Now, not everyone was pleased with Dante's borrowing and his generous use of classical sources. The rigorous were there. In the generation after his work, novices in some monasteries were forbidden from reading the comedy. For these rigorous, like those in the patristic period and in our own, the journey to God required one to divest oneself of such secular support. The humanist author Giovanni Boccaccio, during the time of the Black Death, came to a deeper understanding of his faith and was urged by a monk that you should give up all poetry, since death is surely near. When his friend Francesco Petrarch heard about this, he was alarmed and wrote to Boccaccio in 1362, saying this, "I know of many who have attained the highest saintliness without literary culture. I don't know of any who were excluded by culture. The road to virtue through ignorance is level, but it is fit for lazy souls." Subsequently, Petrarch and Boccaccio together furthered the development of humanism through their promotion and commentaries on classical sources and, of course, on Dante. Once again, we recognize that many thinkers today are dissatisfied with Francis and, of course, with St. Thomas and what they did with the traditions they inherited and with their interpretation of the Christian faith. But to focus on the critique that subsequent centuries fashioned is to miss the point I want to make. Whatever the merits and demerits of these achievements, these influential movements would not have been possible apart from the layers of biblical, mystical, and philosophical traditions that they inherited. These provided the material, the stuff, that in the light of Scripture, they sought to shape into instruments of instruction and praise. That they only imperfectly appropriated and built on these goes without saying. My argument is that the inherited cultural wisdom made possible whatever progress they were able to make. Like them, we too stand on the shoulders of many cultures and multiple voices. And like them, we are called to be stewards of our heritage as they faithfully sought to be of theirs. Conclusion. The theological ground for this I can only just mention briefly, and that is what I take to be the fundamental thrust of the way God works in history. The triune creator in Christ and the continuing presence of the Spirit preserves the creation but further seeks to redeem it and transform it along the way, making hearts of stone into hearts of flesh. Moreover, the goal of history, Scripture insists, is resurrection, not simply of the body, but of the whole cultural order. The whole tendency of the story is toward affirming and establishing what is good and what glorifies God. So we today in our culture, out of humility and love, out of, I hope, out of our sense of service to God, our discipleship. Take, for example, Facebook. Same tiresome, this is a whole subject for another paper, but let me just give this in conclusion. The same tiresome quarrels are being fought here. Either Facebook is part of the single world order that will lead to Antichrist, or it is a God-given tool to help spread the gospel to save the world. Of course, it is neither. It is simply a part of human culture with all the liabilities and assets that this represents. But what it calls us to do is to remember it, relocate it, and repattern it to have our Christian faith somehow inscribed on it. Surely it is limiting but we use it, taking on humbly its assets and liabilities as Christ took on our flesh. No, Facebook will not save Christianity or the church, but Christianity, properly installed and inscribed, just might save Facebook. Thank you.
We're glad to see you back. We're so glad you all are here. I hope you're enjoying yourselves so far. So much fruitful stuff already. I'm really looking forward to the next couple hours, which will be much more dialogical, conversational. So for the next hour, what we've got, I'm really excited about this in particular. Melissa and I have given prompts to 5 people, one of whom is Melissa Stewart, who you'll meet in a few minutes. We've given the same prompt to 5 people who will come at this, I think, from significantly different angles. And the prompt is simply this. In the beginning, God made everything good. What's there left for us to do? What's our role in making good? So it's a intentionally a broad prompt that invites a lot of different angles in. We're thinking in terms of the arts, but not exclusive to the arts. Already Bill's shown us that there's a broader sense of a theology of culture that's at stake here. So that's the prompt, and I'm going to come up quickly 5 different times to introduce people. First up will be Robert Denham, who teaches theory and music composition in the conservatory at Biola. Robert.
Well, greetings. It's a pleasure to be here. And I am a composer, so I'll be speaking from a musical point of view as far as being a creator, if I can use that word. First of all, I want to be very transparent today about how I approach this question. And this question came at a very good time for me because it spoke directly to some of the ups and downs, particularly the downs that we experience as artists. It is easy to become cynical at times. I want to relate back to the movie The Untouchables for just a moment. So Elliot Ness is trying to make a raid on Al Capone's stash of alcohol there during Prohibition, and he's got a bulldozer there, and he's got all the policemen finally lined up, and they're going to make this raid. And Elliot Ness says loudly, "Okay, men, let's do some good." And so they burst through into the warehouse, and they take everybody by surprise, seemingly. And he takes out an axe, opens up one of the boxes, and unfortunately for him, it is not alcohol, it's a parasol. So he opens up the parasol, and in the picture, in the paper, that's the picture that's there. So the next day, then, he overhears policemen in his unit who are laughing, and they say, "Oh yeah," he said, "let's do some good." And okay, so that was, that is sometimes my feeling as an artist. I wonder, hey, does my work count for anything? Does it have purpose? Does it have meaning? The answer the answer is yes. It most certainly does. But at times it can feel like it doesn't. The times that I feel like that, I go to a composers conference, or I go to. I once went to the International Society of Bassists. This is very strange. You see everybody walking around with these huge basses that are taller than these cameras over here, and everybody has one, and if you don't have one, you're suspect. But if you could think of thousands of people walking around with these basses. Anyway, I had a piece as a composer. This was quite prestigious to have a piece on the International Society of Bassists conference. And I think they had, somewhere in the range of 40 concerts over the course of 5 days or something like that. And it's international, so they're coming from all over the world. And I think as a composer, great, this is my chance to get in with the bass community globally. All right, so I'm ambitious here. My bassist, along with the bassoonist that played along, because these low instruments kind of hang out together, they actually traveled 4 hours to Oklahoma City from Amarillo, Texas, to take part in this. And I'm thinking, yes, this is it. I've got everything in line. So we have the concert, and in the audience, there's about 9 people. Because at that point, all the bassists are so absolutely sick of hearing bass music that they just are not attending any more of these concerts. But that was very depressing for me, and it's actually a phenomenon that happens a lot. We write music, there's a big production, and sometimes the ensemble on stage actually outnumbers the people that are in the audience. That can make you wonder, does it really all matter? Other questions we could ask are, how can I make good if nobody can hear my work as it was meant to be performed? What if I write an orchestral piece, but there's no orchestra to perform it? And that's often the case too. We get these file cabinet composers who have these cabinets full of pieces, but nobody has ever heard the piece. Is that making good? What if I don't even like my own work? Ian Krauss at UCLA, a composer that I greatly admire, he writes these wonderful pieces, and he has admitted that he can never listen to them. He cannot stand to listen to them. I think part of it is that he's so self-critical, but they're wonderful pieces, and he just can't listen to them. What if I'm an unknown artist? Does it matter? Does somehow fame translate to I make better good if I'm famous? I make worse good if I'm not famous? These are questions that we have to ask, I think. Okay, now I just want to refute all of that, and I think as image bearers, we have all of these words in Scripture that just infuse us with purpose. And these are generic to all believers, I think, but we are priests. We are rulers. We're going to be rulers. We're friends of Christ. We're brothers and sisters. We are saints. We're trustees of the gospel. All of these should be enough that if we look at any one of those, it reminds us, oh yes, our work does have purpose, and so our work can help bring about good. As believers, here are some other words we could say. We're soldiers in a war, we're runners in a race, we're farmers who cultivate our crops, we are shepherds who watch over our sheep at times, we are our brother's keepers. And then as artists, if I can kind of narrow this down, I think first of all we're stewards. And then as stewards, we have a unique function where we find, we appreciate, we recognize, we show, we display, we explain, we illustrate, we demonstrate, we reflect, we signal, we encourage, and we point to God's goodness as it lies juxtaposed against a wide variety of backdrops. And those backdrops could be light or dark, all of those together. So I was thankful for this question because it made me think through some things that honestly, as an artist or as a composer, it's very easy to forget. Yes, it does have purpose, all of it does, and it does not matter the size of the audience. It does not matter the level of the ensemble. It doesn't matter if I like or dislike my own music, or whether I'm known or unknown. This happens on all kinds of levels right here. And I think the Lord uses us sometimes to affect a wide range of people, and sometimes He uses us simply to affect one person, or it might even just be for us that He's using that work to produce good in us. Just to close, I did come up with a kind of a formal answer here. And so this is what I wrote down. I said, in context of the truth of God's redemptive plan, it is our privilege, and I want to underline privilege, it's our privilege to remember and proclaim in everything that we do the truth of where we came from, where we are, and where we soon will find ourselves to be. The focus then is not on ourselves at all. We are, and I'm going to insert the word merely here for just a second, we are merely the vessels or the instruments that God uses. Now let me replace the word merely. We are, surprisingly, the vessels and the instruments that God uses. We are extraordinarily the instruments and vessels that God uses. And it is His plan that we serve and not our own. So I'll end with that.
Theologians have the same problem. I was at a conference once, and it was an early 8 o'clock session, and I walked into this huge ballroom, and there was a man on a stage speaking at a podium, and there was no one there. And it was being recorded, so we had to, and I walked in, it was a little late, and he said, "For those of you just entering the room," it was so classy, but it made the point. Our next speaker is Melissa Schubert. I want to particularly draw attention to Melissa because she and I, along with Barry Kramus and the CCCA, have really planned the whole week, and she's been remarkably just good at all of this stuff. She's done so much work. In fact, let's give her some applause.
I'm going to zoom in on one particular feature of how we make good, and something that I think about as someone who doesn't make art but studies aesthetic objects, mostly poems, literature. If I did make art, it would have to be what Jenna Maroney from 30 Rock says, living theatrically in everyday life. This is my hopeful art making. I'm not going to talk about that today. I'm going to talk about what other people do better than me, and that's make metaphors. So writers make verbal metaphors, but I do think that art making is a metaphorical trade. One theorist, George Lakoff, who writes about metaphor, says the essence of metaphor, I think this is helpful, is understanding and experiencing one kind of thing in terms of another. So that's a very, it's a useful account. It's wide in its potential application, whether you think about Milton in his first line of the Paradise Lost poem we were thinking about, of man's first disobedience and the fruit, where the word disobedience is metrically transgressive, and all of a sudden sin becomes a breaking of certain kinds of patterns and boundaries. Or my understanding of my own experience as a amateur or failure of gardener through Louise Gluck's poems, in which the narrator is herself a gardener, and there I'm getting metaphor, or Spencer making an argument that fairyland's plausible because people just found Peru for the first time. So how could we assume that there aren't other worlds that have yet to be discovered? Or how Shakespeare makes really public and popular the already existent metaphor that all the world's a stage. And these are just literary examples of the metaphorical not doing sufficient service to the ways that other art objects are providing metaphor for us, where we're understanding and experiencing one thing in terms of another. So the metaphor can happen in the content, but it also can happen in the experience, that we understand and experience parts of our life that are less crafted by experiencing aesthetic objects that have themselves been more meaningfully rendered. Metaphor, I think, simultaneously discovers unities and disunities. This is my favorite part. So some metaphors reflect fullness or likeness or connection. And then, to some extent, metaphors will, even the same metaphors that discover unities, they might uncover absence or disjunct or disconnection. So, a man who is lion-hearted still can't walk about with lions. There's likeness and unlikeness simultaneously. When I think about metaphor making in relation to the question, what part do we have in making good, I want to say two things about what we don't do as metaphor makers. We do not and did not make the fundamental relationships of likeness between things that we then do discover in the world. So what God has done in creation, in its preservation, we didn't do. So that he made by, through, and for Christ is part of why we can find likenesses in the world, that it's held together is another reason why we can find likenesses. That he presumably, Basil of Caesarea teaches that he made the world as school for souls. So even that We can discover metaphor and likenesses and relate ourselves to objects we encounter that might have even been by God's work and not ours primarily. And the second thing we don't do is we do not close the gap between things that differ. We do not finally unite unlike and like things. And here's where I find a particular theological notion that Irenaeus, and did you call him, Bill, a 3rd century theologian? Someone did recently. I was going to sloppily say 2nd. Oh, good. Okay, good. Okay, so 2nd century theologian Irenaeus talks about Christ as a recapitulation. He has a theology of recapitulation. He says, the Son of God, being at first with the Father, born before all creation, and being revealed to all the world at the close of the age as man, is recapitulating all things in himself, the Word of God, things in heaven and on earth. This is a word that he's borrowing or adopting from Paul to the Ephesians. In Ephesians, the word that God saw fit to recapitulate all things in Christ is sometimes translated to unite all things in him, to sum up, to reestablish, to gather into one. It's a tricky word. It has the word cephalus in it, which is head, so to bring everything under headship, but capitulo is Latin for head, and so we also have this verbal sense of recapitulation, or this logical trope of I finish my whole argument and I recapitulate it. So I'm bringing all things under headship, summary. These are all suggested in this strange word. And the way that Irenaeus unpacks it is radically poetic. And he says that the word became flesh because flesh had become unlike itself. So the necessity for recapitulation was actually an increase of disunity in the things that were made. The things that were made were becoming less like themselves. So God in Christ recapitulates. And so he says a couple things. This re-saying of Adam, Irenaeus unpacks in a couple wonderfully poetic ways. The first formed Adam from the virgin earth and the wisdom and will of God. And by the way, he says it's the virgin earth because Genesis reports the earth had not been tilled. So he says the first formed was from the virgin earth. Thus it was fitting that it would be of a virgin by the will and wisdom of God that the second formed would come and recapitulate. He talks about how the transgression occurred through the tree. It had to be undone by the obedience of the tree, so that the tree of the knowledge of good and evil for the first formed, it becomes the tree of death, but the tree of suffering becomes the tree of life. And last, and this is probably the most strange to me of Irenaeus, he says, Christ, the word who from the beginning pervades the length and breadth. I can't do this with my hands. Length, breadth, depth, and height. So he tries to give us 4 directions that Christ has always pervaded. That was from the beginning. He has done that in all things invisibly. And then he makes the form of the cross visible and material in his recapitulation of all things. This is to say, here's something human makers can't do. We can't fully recapitulate. But I take it that when we're making metaphors, we're doing one of 2 things. I think sometimes we're promising, or we're hinting at the promise of the fulfillment of recapitulation. And I think that sometimes we are cultivating longing for recapitulation. So we're noticing the absence or the disjoint, the things that are not here yet. I have an example of one and an example of the other, and then I'll be done. My example, and I have ample options, but for some reason I'm picking one I just happen to like. My example of the metaphor that presents likenesses, that suggests fullness, it's actually from a sermon, Lancelot Andrew's sermon, Elizabethan Jacobean homilist, who was always referring to sort of the semiotic richness of the world. He has this Easter sermon, and he's talking about Mary's reunion with the risen Christ outside of the tomb. And you remember that the risen Christ is unrecognizable to her. She mistakes him for the gardener at the tomb. And Andrew's comments, now he that was thought lost is found again, and found not as he was sought for, not a dead body, but a living soul, nay, a quickening spirit then. And that might Mary Magdalene well say, for he quickened her, and her spirits were as good as dead. For in very deed a kind of resurrection it was. In her, revised and raised from a dead and drooping to a lively and cheerful estate. And then he says, the gardener, with a capital G, had done his part, made her all green on a sudden. So here we have Andrew's pressing deeply into this accident of incognito, the incognito resurrected Christ, and saying, oh no, he is truly gardener. Here is the fullness of things. He is gardener, bringing to life dead things even in the souls of his daughters and sons. So there are times where metaphors, I think, promise fulfillment. And then there are times where I think metaphors highlight for us what we feel in the loss of the loss of things, disconnectedness. And I think part of our making good is sometimes to observe loss and grief and disconnectedness with an eye towards fulfillment. Here's where I think Marilyn Robinson does us radical service right now. And I'll just read one section from her novel, Housekeeping, and refer you to it more if you want to get a better sense of what I think she's doing. Her narrator of sorts has this memory of being abandoned by her mother, and she says that as they sat on the porch being told to wait for their mother who never came back, Ruth says, this established in me the habit of waiting and expectation, which makes any present moment most significant for what it does not contain. And later, there's richer reflection on this, and it's didactic, but worth hearing. For need can blossom into all the compensation it requires. To crave and to have are as like as a thing and its shadow. For when does a berry break upon the tongue as sweetly as when one longs to taste it? And when is the taste refracted into so many hues and savors of ripeness and earth? And when do our senses know anything so utterly as when we lack it? And here again is a foreshadowing. The world will be made whole. For to wish for a hand on one's hair is all but to feel it. So whatever we may lose, very craving gives it back to us again. Here is metaphor, longing for recapitulation, another thing we do to make good. Thank you.
This is bad grammar, but this is funner and funner, isn't it? Next up is Doug Huffman. Doug teaches biblical studies. He's a New Testament scholar, and he's also an associate dean in the Talbot School of Theology. Doug.
Our discussion question about the role of humanity in making good clearly takes its jumping off point from a repeated refrain in the creation account of Genesis 1. In that opening chapter of Hebrew Scriptures, as God unfolds his creation, he repeatedly surveys his work and sees that it was good. And then at the end, God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. If God made the world good, indeed very good, what role does humanity have in making good? Well, a natural leap to take from that jumping off point is to the Genesis 1 statement of how it is humanity was created. In fact, that's talked about right before that final "it is very good" statement was made in Genesis 1. So in particular, I'll focus on the one brief phrase found there, the metaphor, the image of God. Perhaps ironically, much has been written about this very briefly used phrase in Scripture, 5 times in the Old Testament and twice in the New Testament. So we can ask with Stephen Holmes, why then should the Christian theological tradition have fastened onto this phrase and not some other to describe what makes humanity unique within creation? Of course, significance is not to be confused with prevalence, and the place of humanity in the created realm is directly addressed by that phrase in Genesis 1. And indeed, since not just Adam, but all of his descendants are said to be made in the image of God, it's no wonder that the phrase gets so much attention. But as Holmes notes further, the meaning of the image of God is not at all clear within the Genesis account. That this is what sets humanity apart from the beasts is clear enough, but what it might denote is much less obvious. Thus, the exact nature of the correspondence between God and humanity that can be described as the image of God has been debated for centuries. Interpretations of this correspondence range all the way from sharing of characteristics and attributes, even the physical realm of attributes, to a relationship in which the human race does not resemble God in any way, but merely represents him somehow. Does the image of God entail that humans are like God in terms of their appearance and or in terms of their function and or in terms of rationality and or in terms of possessing a moral will? Of the multivarious attempts to define the imago Dei, many can be clustered together in, I'll suggest, 3 different perspectives: ontological, functional, or relational. Ontologically, it's clear enough that humans are not equal with God, but we're somehow analogous to him. The creation narrative and broader Pentateuch make it very clear that God is eternal spirit creator, while humans are non-eternal physical creatures. To be in the image of God cannot mean equivalence between deity and humanity, but only some analogous or corresponding relationship between the two. As Kevin Van Hooser puts it, the doctrine that human beings were created in the imago Dei directs us to associate the notions of humankind and divinity without confusing them. Where the doctrine of creation trains us to draw a God-humankind distinction, the doctrine of the imago Dei trains us to make a God-humankind connection. God bless metaphors. Thanks, Melissa. So that's ontologically. Functionally, the creation narrative shows humanity to be God's agents ruling over the other created things. God commands Adam, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it, rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air and over every living creature that moves on the ground. In favor of a functional understanding of the imago Dei is the recognition that these human rulers in the ancient world actually regularly put up little representations of themselves in their territories that they ruled. They believed not that the statues were actually to be gods worshipped in their stead, but rather that those statues invoked their presence. Maybe humanity is functionally representing God wherever he places us. And thirdly, that humans are relational beings is hardly controversial. Nevertheless, despite the emphasis on humans being created male and female in Genesis chapter 1, this potential unity within a diversity, unity with a difference, sort of comparison between humanity and the Trinity is not always very convincing, primarily because male and female representation is abundantly present in the animal world. So how can that be part of the image of God? On the other hand, there certainly is a level of relationality, to invent a word, for humans that is substantially unique in the created order. That this relational uniqueness is perhaps bound up in our ontological spirituality, and our functional use of language makes me suspect some more robust combination of these three different ways of thinking about this metaphor, the image of God. I'm not alone in this. Apparently, Eugene Merrill draws on these concepts, pulling them together. He writes, humankind is in the image of God, but also serves as the image of God. Humans have resemblance to God, even if limited, but they stand in God's place in the administration of God's creation. So, if we could build upon this complex of three different ways of thinking about the image of God, it seems clear enough to me that the image of God involves an entangled entailment of maybe three elements, and I'll give them all the letter R to prove I went to seminary. First, humans are relational. We see non-human creatures in communion and even relating themselves not to only to one another, but to other parts of creation, and we relate to art. But nothing in the non-human world works relationally the same way that it does in the human world. Nothing quite like human-to-human relationships, and there's certainly nothing in the animal world that corresponds to human-to-God relationships. Merrill observes that the creation narrative is structured in such a way as to point out the uniqueness of humanity's relationality. Indeed, it seems that God was giving Adam a lesson on the unique relational quality of being human when he had Adam naming the animals prior to the creation of a partner for him in Eve. The second R, humans are resourceful. We can observe that some non-human creatures are resourceful at some level, but God gave Adam the creative task of naming the animals and not the other way around. God has given humans a level of resourcefulness that has resulted in innovative inventions and the creative construction of complex contraptions. Animals communicate, but only humans write books about communication. Some animals use rudimentary tools and systematically solve simplistic problems, but the only animals to enter outer space have done so by human decision and by means of human constructions. Humans are resourceful. Third, humans are responsible. With the advancements over other creatures, humans are commissioned by the Creator to have unique authority and responsibility over the rest of the created order. This is made clear in the creation mandate that we read in Genesis 1. But let me hasten to add, however, that we've not always done very well with our responsibility over creation. The uniquely human ability to create pollution is an ever-present evidence of our propensity to fall short. No other creature pollutes, but we do. It's somewhat ironic that those created in the image of God must be commanded not to dishonor their Creator by, among other acts of rebellion, creating any images of God. Nevertheless, our unique God-given level of responsibility is an earmark of humanity. So let me close up here. Making good and the image of God. In light of these three entailments, perhaps we can in some sense recognize God's Trinitarian nature as part of the reflection of the Imago Dei in humanity. And here I will switch from using the noun image to using the verb to image. In some sense, the Trinity is a communion, and we relational humans image that communion in a way that other creatures do not. In some sense, the members of the Trinity were each involved in creation, and we resourceful humans image that creativity by making goods in ways that other creatures do not. But this resourceful, creative work of humanity has both substantial limits, only God creates ex nihilo, and moral limits. So in some way, the Trinity is the ultimate measure of character, and we responsible humans are expected to image that character in a way that other creatures do not. When it comes to mankind's making, motives, methods, and materials matter monumentally. Indeed, humans must be good in making goods, but the fallen image struggles to image. Thanks be to God for Christ, the true image of the invisible God. Thanks.
Amy Cannon is a poet who teaches in the English department at Biola.
Because I'm a writer, forgive me for reading something I've written rather than extemporizing as admirably as our fellow speakers have. When God made the world and called it good, God's will was effected for the good of what he had created. Creation was good in itself and for itself. However, in the words of Gerard Manley Hopkins, the goodness of God which shines through the created order has been, quote, seared with trade, bleared, smeared with toil, and wears man's smudge and shares man's smell. The soil is bare now, nor can the foot feel being shod, unquote. The goodness of God and the goodness of God's creation have been obscured, misperceived, and misused. Yet redemption is possible, is promised, and is so because goodness persists. Though sometimes whittled down to a single righteous soul and his family, sometimes to a small and wandering people, God's gracious communion with those made in his image has remained, as has the testimony of God's glory through all creation, subjected though it has been to the same futility that fetters us. The promise of redemption offers the hope that there remains in the world and in we who work it some germ of the good sowed into us all at the beginning. That creation will not be entirely unmade, but will be made new, and that our sweating selves do not demand to be demolished, but only indwelt and transformed, encourages us as grateful creatures and hopeful creators that there remains good to be worked. Often conversations about faith and art focus on whether and how faith is to be expressed through art, how our creative impulse imitates and mirrors back God's own generation on which our existence depends, and the regeneration in which we place our hope. Perhaps because I am the least theologically trained or astute of my esteemed colleagues today, I thought to turn my attention to what it is that our creativity has to say to our Christianity, rather than the reverse, and how by the act of making, we may find ourselves making good. Firstly, the aim of human making is always, in some measure, transcendence. Where God can create from nothing, as has been noted, our creative medium is that of found materials. But even the stray things of the world, ink and paper, brush and paint, hands and clay, have in them the potential to transcend themselves. Art alters materials to forge meaning where there was once only unrealized objects. It has the ability to activate potential energy, to enliven and elucidate and instruct in ways the materials that make up the art do not. Once made, meaning adheres and is found to be infectious. Plums take on a furtive sheen after one reads William Carlos Williams' famous failed apology, "This is just to say." And what numinous blue can escape evocations of Chagall for those who know and love his paintings? If you are willing to believe that my love is like a red, red rose, then neither my love nor the rose come away from the encounter of simile entirely unchanged. The imaginative act of naming has power to enrich our perceptions and our understanding. After Burns' poem, both our concept of the rose and of the beloved carry away a bit of each other with them. Who, even of the artists themselves, can say how swaths of color, layered and blended and shaped, become things we hang in museums and chapels, become objects of reverence and almost of worship? Who can adequately account for how, as Shakespeare puts it, sheep's guts should hale souls out of men's bodies in music? Idolatry is the name we give the temptation to honor created work over much because of how it glimmers with and offers glimpses of the divine. One work art does is to demonstrate to us how the world might be transformed and transfigured. It offers presages of that day when all of heaven and earth will be made new. Even art at its most performative or provocative offers a kind of vision we can be changed by. Art evinces a desire for and testifies to the truth of some overriding meaning, some coherence to the whole, which we imitate and anticipate. And I'm going to quote Marilyn Robinson in her novel Housekeeping, following immediately up on the quotation that Melissa shared, so you have great context. She says, "What are all these fragments for, if not to be knit up finally?" Another way in which we might make good as artists is to apprentice ourselves to the virtues of our craft. Virtue of craft often runs parallel to virtue of character. Perfecting one's craft, developing one's art, requires dogged faithfulness, ceaseless patience, unending humility, unkillable hope, and inexhaustible love. Though these virtues are turned toward the material, they offer a model and a practice for the greater challenge of lived character. It isn't likely that God will leave untouched our callings or careers in his regenerative work, and the ethical dimensions of the tasks we undertake can inform our journey toward Christ-likeness. Of course, virtues of craft and virtues of character need not be coupled. Great artists are rarely saintly, and great saints are infrequently artistic. But for those of us interested in imitating God's gesture by learning to make good, we may well seek to do so by, in the first place, making well. Another analogy art provides to faith is that of habitation. Heidegger quotes a line from the German Romantic poet Hölderlin, you got to get the umlaut in there, "Poetically man dwells," in an essay of the same name. He argues that through the craft of poetry, we carve out the space within which we live. Heidegger notes that making in the Greek has the same root as poetry, poiesis. He offers that although, quote, "the things of the imagination are merely made," unquote, that this making, this, quote, "poetic creation, which lets us dwell, is a kind of building," unquote. The German here seems to have the same ambiguity as in English. Building is both the act of building and the kind of shelter that arises from that act. What we make, in the end, shelters us. It is shaped by our imagination and, in turn, houses that imagining. Art offers a space in which to stand, from which we might orient ourselves to a larger reality. The word stanza, the term for a unit of poetry analogous to a paragraph of prose, derives from the Italian word for room. As Heidegger would argue, stanzas are the spaces in which poetry happens, the habitation we shape of words for their meaning to indwell. In the same way, doctrine, the delimiting tenets of faith, can be viewed as the capacity of Christianity, the space supported by the structure of belief within which we abide. It is Christ in whom we live and move and have our being, and it is the capacities of the Christian faith within which the faithful abide. Rather than viewing belief as constricting or even as merely sheltering, we may think of it as room that has been made for us, the rooms we dwell in before we attain the many mansions the Lord has promised to prepare. It is from within our faith that we make art, and the art we make, in turn, is also capacious, has the capacity to be inhabited by our faith. Perhaps because of the kind of attention toward language that writing poetry asks, I'm fairly entranced by what a turn of phrase can evoke. I went to the dictionary, like every good freshman about to write a paper, to run through what senses there are for saying someone has made good. The answer is many. One may make good by repairing damage done, by succeeding, by demonstrating the truth of something, by attaining or retaining, or by effecting or fulfilling something promised. There are ways in which each of these senses can be applied to how art offers to make good. We may make good in light of God's making good by embodying our desire for wholeness through the orientation of art toward a holistic vision. We make good by enacting the capacities of the world to be indwelt by spirit, by imitating and aiming for the transcendent. We make good by making well, by letting the practice of craft tutor the practice of virtue in our lives. And we make good by filling and fulfilling the space offered to us within our work and within our faith, inhabiting and indwelling what good God has offered us. Thank you.
Did I mention Amy is an alum of Biola University? John Anderson is a painter and writer who teaches in the art department at Biola.
Thank you. Strangely enough, this might gather up several of the things that have been said up to this point. Though I don't feel like I have entirely in my grasp the implications of what I'm going to say. So perhaps you can help me with this later on. In their work, both Trevor Hart and Bill Dyrness have shown that for Christians, the arts must be understood as one of the fundamental ways that humans care for and cultivate the earth. And in the process, this is one of the fundamental ways that we humans work out our own humanness. The arts are thus situated as a vital component within the broader God-given human vocation to make something of the world. For the visual arts specifically, which is my area of specialty, I want to suggest that art is one of the primary ways that we cultivate visual meaning. Or put another way, art is one of the primary ways that we cultivate the meanings of the world and the meanings of human life in specifically visual and spatial and bodily terms. In short, visual art is a negotiation of a certain register of meaning. At the center of my definition of art is not necessarily skillful craftsmanship, originality, beauty, or even visual pleasure. Rather, at the center of at least my understanding of art is a certain range of meaningfulness that is worked out in visual material forms and in visual material logics. To be clear, when I talk about meaningfulness here, I'm not simply referring to the kinds of meanings that take verbal form, nor am I restricting it to meanings that fall within rational categories. In fact, one of the wonderful things about the arts is that they often generate and provide access to meanings that are quite difficult to verbalize and that seem to spill outside of rational analysis. But they are meaningful nonetheless. The kinds of meanings I have in view here include those which we experience in certain combinations of sounds, or in the sensation of the precarious distribution of weight in a sculpture, Richard Serra sculpture, for instance, or in the dark nothingness of the paintings in Rothko's chapel in Houston, and so on and so on. All these things are richly meaningful, but often in ways that follow a visual or bodily logic and are thus difficult to signify verbally very often. Our life is at every moment full of these kinds of meaningfulness, even though the vast majority of them are tacit, largely subconscious, and unattended to. The specific function of art is to bring the excessive meaningfulness of our visual worlds and embodied experience into the foreground for more meaningful inspection and development of them, of those meanings. One of the primary ways that we perform this cultivation of visual meaning is by setting aside objects specifically for a closer scrutiny to how they mean in any given context. In other words, key to my understanding of art is not primarily a matter of form, but a matter of occurrence. It is something that happens. It is, to take up the topic here, it is a making good. It's not an object. Art isn't an object, I don't think. And this, I'm largely following Nicholas Wolterstorff. On the one hand, conceptual art theorists on the other, though I'm modifying both perhaps. Along with them, I want to assert that art should be more understood in terms of action than in terms of form, when you get down to it. Art is not a quality or aspect of an object, nor is it even a kind of object, I think. Rather, it's a kind of function that an object performs in a culture, in a society. The classic example is Duchamp, Marcel Duchamp. The only difference between a urinal in the men's bathroom right now and a urinal, Duchamp's fountain, is that the latter has been set aside for us to question and argue about, and thus ultimately to experience for the sake of how it prompts deep and difficult questions of meaning, the definition of art, and so forth. And art occurs wherever this function occurs. That's the whole point of Duchamp. He's being outrageous, I suppose, but it's to make a very deep point. The art is not in the object, it's in the use of the object and in the way it functions in a society. When I say the word, as an example, when I say the word hammer, An image immediately leaps to mind, perhaps. And I would venture to guess that these images that just came into your mind are fairly common from one person to another in this crowd. But of course, with further consideration, we quickly realize that there are a wide variety, a wide array of objects called hammer, each of which is particular to different kinds of action. They're not only your average carpenter's hammers, but also sledgehammers, ball-peen hammers, upholstery hammers, tuning hammers, piano hammers, gavels, rubber mallets, and so on and so on. We refer to certain objects as hammers, certain objects, but we do so only because these objects are particularly well suited for the certain kinds of actions that we might refer to as hammering. The point is that, properly speaking, a hammer is whatever is used for hammering. And even though we might in fact hammer with any number of things, we judge a good hammer as that which is particularly well suited to the kind of hammering we want to do. Art, I think, is very much the same kind of thing. Not in terms of being an instrument, but in terms of performing a certain kind of action, being set aside for that action or taken up for that action. When I say art, something might immediately leap to mind as characteristic of that term, a painting, a sculpture, just as the image of a hammer leapt to mind. But in fact, art is not a certain kind of thing as much as it is a certain kind of function that thing performs within a community of people. And it's a thing mobilized towards a certain kind of function with regards to what and how the thing means. It's the meaningfulness where art really gets going. On Tuesday, as an example, Dan Callis described the relation between his paintings and the markings and patterns made on the back of delivery trucks, city signage, etc. The difference is that Dan specifically sets these paintings before us for our consideration of them. And when his work really works, it sends us back into the world of trucks and signs and the whole of our everyday world with a new sensitivity and alertness to the density of meaning that we are utterly immersed in at all times. And his paintings are a wonderful, gracious activity of sorts that drive us back into the world with a different sense of meaningfulness. And that is the artistic function, I think. Thus, like a hammer, we might say that art has less to do with a defining noun than it has to do with defining a verb. This or that thing is art when it is effectively arting, I want to say. In the same way that hammers serve a very broad diversity of functions, so too art. Visual art does not simply show, though that's certainly one of the actions it can perform. It might also enact in all sorts of other ways. Some artwork functions much like a sledgehammer, while others more like a tuning hammer or a rubber mallet. And at the end of the day, just as almost anything could be used to hammer, provided that it serves the function, so too just about any object might serve as art, provided that it be redeployed in such a way as that we find ourselves questioning the meaningfulness of our lives. I think that's where art gets going. That's where good art gets going. It just so happens that the objects that tend to do this most readily are often those objects that are, like Dan's paintings, invested with a great deal of some person's strivings with regards to the meaningfulness of forms. And as a caveat, the action that I'm describing as art doing, I don't think is just the action of the artist, nor is it bound by the intentions of the artist. And that is probably the failure of my hammer comparison, because the hammering is often a one-person job, so to speak. But rather, when art is acting, it is opening up consideration of meanings for us. In the end, to close, I think this Wolterstorffian conceptualist model provides the most robust means of thinking about the ways that art is a cultivation of the earth, a making good. And I don't have time to develop this here, partly because it's really hard. It opens up into really difficult issues, but I want to offer a suggestion that once we begin thinking in this way, that is, considering art as a kind of action that is a means of cultivating meaningfulness, then suddenly the arts are cast into two dimensions that otherwise art is sometimes restricted from, very intentionally restricted from, the ethical and the eschatological. If artworks are objects of action, rather than primarily objects of a stable aesthetic value, then they are embedded in broad networks of social relationships that beg questions of justice, just relationships between people, loving relationships between people, because they're wound up in those relationships already. And secondly, they're oriented by some kind of a hopefulness, some kind of a vision towards the other and towards some kind of ends, some kind of future social relationship perhaps, some sort of a state of the world, state of the earth. Whether acknowledged or not, I think all art is ultimately ethical and ultimately eschatological. It is, in the first sense, it's ethical because it's a form of human action in relation to other human actions. It's never autonomous. It's never isolated. Aesthetics can never be disentangled from ethics. But in the second sense, art is eschatological because it's a temporal, contextualized action aimed by desire and aimed by hope for some kind of notion of the all in all. Thank you.
If I can invite Trevor and Bill and all of our respondents up on the stage here, we're going to have a conversation for the next 45 minutes or so before some concluding remarks by Trevor. I'm the moderator. I'll take liberty to offer 3 words, also in response to the prompt, and then actually to prep you two, Trevor and Bill. I think I might ask you to very briefly respond to this prompt too on what our role is in making good. Just quickly, I think it was, and maybe one of you all can check me too, I think it was Heidegger who said Denken is Donken. Is that right? Thinking is thanking, and that strikes me as one way into the question of what role we have in making good. Well, we have an utterly responsive role in which our very making is itself. I think it always is, and it certainly ought to be a form of gratitude. So fundamentally, I'm going to give a very short answer. What's our role in making good? It's saying thank you through attention and engagement with the world as it's been given to us. So that's one thought. Trevor and Bill, do you want to say anything just to this prompt briefly?
Where can I start and stop? Yes, I mean, picking up on that directly, I think. I've used the image sometimes of artistry as Eucharistic, by which, of course, I don't mean sacramental necessarily, although sometimes one might want to explore that as an image. But Eucharistic in the sense that it is an offering back of something which is aware of first having received something in a disposition of gratitude. And that's true, I think, in my experience, not just of artists who are Christians, in fact, not just of artists who have any particular religious disposition, but of artists who just realize that they've been given a gift, I mean themselves, a sort of creative gift, and that the materials with which they've begun have so much potential, so much richness latent within them, that in a sense exploring the work, making the work, has been a voyage of discovery, rather than one of self-realization, which I think is sometimes the image we have of artists, as sort of realizing themselves, realizing their individual vision through imposing shape on things. I mean, maybe there's an aspect of that, but I think much more. Most artists I've talked to see making art, see their artistry as with a real sense of, I have been given something good, I may not know who from or where from, and I just feel the need to make something of it and to offer it back. And for a Christian, of course, that we have a language for describing that. I mean, language of liturgy, of thanksgiving. But I sense that even in artists who have no religious context at all, but they still feel that they're actually offering something back to someone or for the public or whatever. And this is as much a matter of gratitude as it is of self-achievement.
Well, I was struck by, is it Tricia?
Amy? Yeah.
Amy, sorry. But your reference to art being intrinsically transcendent. And I think that's really, there's something very profound, and John, you picked up on that the idea of however naturalistic or atheistic an artist may be, still they're making a reference that wants to transcend itself, that wants to speak beyond simply this object here, that makes some reference to something they love, something beyond what you can see. And then you picked up on the idea that it's ethical, it's an ethical action, that it's transcendent because it expresses a kind of hope for something. And I think of Bruner's idea that art is intrinsically redemptive in the sense that it's taking something and making good of it. So you can add redemption, by the way, to that. So it's ethics, it's redemption, but it's all of that. It's ethics, small e, it's redemption, small r, and it's transcendent, small t, in a certain sense. But there's still something there that I think artists need to be reminded of, to think that you're not as irreligious as you think.
So, I want to run with that. So let me play a devil's advocate moment here and say I'm an irreligious artist, and I want to be taken seriously in the integrity of my own work. And you come up to me and say, well, no, you're doing this transcendent sort of thing. And I just say, well, that's patently not what I'm doing. In fact, I disavow any notion of the religious in my work at all. How would you respond? I mean, Bill, or really any of you, how would you all respond to that?
Well, I would say if they start talking about the work at all in any hopeful sort of way that what they wanted to do, they're going to start using language that is implicitly transcendent. That's what I would do.
I mean, I suspect there's probably difference in the usage of the word transcendence at that point.
Yeah.
There's even something about, I don't know, if the work that an artist has done is given over to others in any way, there's some hope of some sort of shared experience or this mediation. Is that fair? So anyway, I think that that's a kind of transcendence, or it suggests something hovering over me, you, and this. John, you were going to jump in.
Only to say that it opens, well, I think one of the ways to open an argument, because it will just get into an argument that needs to be had, which is great. But I think I would say respectfully, well, that's nice you think that, but just as an artist might say, well, my work is not economic or political, a Marxist critic would say, well, you might not recognize that it is, but if it's a material object that is used by others, it is an economic and political object. And feminist critics would say the same thing, or something analogous. You might not think that your work has anything to do with gender codes, but if you're a human, it has something to do with gender. And I think I want to say something similar about what do we call it? The transcendent or the religious aspect, the spiritual aspect of art. It might not be a conscious part of your work, but if you're human, I want to say, it's already bound up in a world that I think is...
Yeah, so if I can, I mean, a bit of a plug, I suppose. If I understand a book that Bill and John are working on together, it's but the thesis is roughly something like modern art, that epoch of art, which has nothing to do with God, is really all about God. I mean, are you doing something like that? I mean, are you all making this art?
I would want to nuance that quite a bit.
Very rough.
I mean, that it's not all about God, but that interpreting modern art in terms of its theological and religious and spiritual dimensions has, I think, been underdeveloped and often overlooked. And all we want to say is, no, that is an aspect of how we should consider the meaningfulness of modern art. It's not, if it's made by humans, it's already a theological object to some extent. We don't want to reduce it to that. It's all about God, but...
If you want me to write the back, jacket.
Yeah, I'll just go.
Spoiler alert.
No, and I think to pick up on the idea of John's idea that art does something, I think that may be a way into the transcendent discussion, by the way, because all artists, as you were saying, Melissa, they want it to do something. They want it to come alive. They don't want it to be dead. They want it to say, I find such, I come alive when I look at your work. I mean, that's what they want. They want it to be life-giving in a certain sense. And our argument is at critical moments in modern art, when art really did capture something that was life-giving, those moments in some cases were parasitic on religious traditions, in the sacramental tradition in France and the Orthodox tradition of icons, for example. That there were, these religious traditions were still working, and they were still active. And then the other sense in which there was an implicit religious move being made in the case of some artists that we would like to highlight. It's not all about religion, but it's partly.
I also wanted to mention, I think, an element, that's probably unique to art making, more so than, say, systematic theology or even the writing of an essay, or more explicitly attempting to craft a concept of the world explicitly, as opposed to in the sort of subterranean ways that John was talking about, is that more than other things, art becomes unbounded from the intentions of the creator in a certain way, that it has a life in itself, and it has a life, which John touched on, of the interaction with the audience, that's equally, if not, more valid or more broad than the artist may have conceived of themselves. But if, as you brought up, Matt, the artist is being thankful in the ways that we hope someone would have gratitude, by being attentive, by being receptive, and by loving the materials that they engage, and attempting for there to be some truthfulness in them, then I think we would say, as the world reflects God and has the capacity to gesture toward more than itself, that's something that would inhere in art, sort of regardless of whether an artist may have intended it. And as an audience member, that's something that you can have confidence in saying about the art, I think, as something that you've received from that.
And Amy, I heard you zooming in your presentation on even that the sort of uncovering or imbuing of life at the level of the reorienting materials. So that now you were just talking about it, once it's out there, it's having life, but even to think about how ink and vellum and guts become, and plants become something else, and something more alive. I think that's another moment of that move towards transcendence that you were describing.
Yeah.
And I want to ask, I teach apologetics, so I'm interested in apologetics, so I want to push the question and say, how do you account for that? If you put that out there and you want that, how do you account for that? And I would say, as John would say, as a Christian, this is how I account for it. How do you account for it? I mean, that's a conversation that I think we need to have, and it's an important conversation.
You invite a story that gives a rationale for where this comes from.
Which takes us back to C.S. Lewis's, the stuff we were talking about the other day, Trevor, his inviting, Lewis's way to invite people in to consider life from this vantage point and see how that works much better than some other vantage point. Yeah.
I think there's several ways into this conversation. I want to pick up something that Trevor said about, for artists, it isn't necessarily about self-expression. Well, I just wrote an article in which I picked up on the notion of self-expression that itself needs justification. I mean, that is a pretty common understanding of how artists look at their work. I don't want to make any universal statement. I'm expressing something unique about myself, about my vision. Well, how do you account for that? How do you ground that? And I made the theological point that ultimately I think it has to be grounded on our understanding of what it means to be a person. And if you open that conversation up, then Christianity has a fairly a lot to contribute to the conversation, going back to the Christological debates and so forth.
It seems like Christianity can both really underwrite the notion of human artistry as self-expression and deeply criticize it. So we have the theology of the Imago Dei, the particularity of the human person, the fact that the second person of the Trinity took on particular human flesh, all of this, which seems to say that each individual is of such unique worth and dignity that for that to be expressed makes all the sense in the world. And yet at the same time, you have this rich sense of a responsibility to be representatives of God in the world on behalf of people other than ourselves, and a model, even in the particular Jesus who gives his life away, so that I don't know whether artists should self-express or self-divest in their work. And I could see both biblically funded.
Part of where that comes from, of course, is what Bill referred to earlier on, and that is that there's this sudden shift at the early Renaissance where you suddenly get the words that have only ever been used to refer to what God does in the beginning, deployed now metaphorically with a real stretch to refer to what human artists do and what philosophers do and what the most cutting edge of scientists were doing. And of course, well, what's the God that we're talking about and comparing ourselves to in that way? What's he perceived as doing at creation? And there's a model of that which says, well, what God does is he has this great idea and then he expresses it, and it's, well, there's something in that, but I'm not sure that's really the appropriate picture, even for how God creates. My daughters have long since exposed me to High School Musical. And
you sure that was the direction of...
Well, this is a cultural reference. You need to take it on. And I think it's Charmaine. Somebody will tell me here sings this song. It's all about me, and it's like that's the theme. It's all about me. Well, that's not true at creation. Okay, if you read the text of Scripture canonically, which you have to, it's not a me thing, it's an us thing, even in God. So a Trinitarian grounding of creation seems to me to require a rethinking of this sort of radical individualism, which seems to me to be a misreading of it. I mean, quite apart from the brass neck of applying it to human artists, it's a misreading of what God is about in creation, it seems to me. So I think something much more relational, something much more shared, something that recognizes that creativity is always a matter, certainly for us, but seemingly also for God in some way analogously. We're enabled to be creative by others who permit us to be, whether that's other people or those on whose shoulders we stand or those who encourage us, whatever it is. It's not all about me. It never is. And to the extent we think it is, we're deluding ourselves.
There's an analogy to creativity from Irenaeus' famous line that the glory of God is humanity alive, such that God's manifest brilliance, his character on display in the world, is seen precisely in giving this robust liveliness and integrity to that which is not himself, so that there's this utterly non-competitive sense here in which you might say God's ultimate self-expression is the granting of the expression of another.
And I think expression's a misleading term too, because sometimes expression really does mean something that simply begins within me. So, almost in the way that a scream does. Okay, but expression is also what happens when I experience something out there in the world and then tell you about it. I mean, reality comes through me. So of course it's me expressing it, but it's not necessarily just me I'm talking about, or my emotions, or anything else.
Robert, can I ask about musical composition? So it's one comment and then a thought, or a question. So the comment is, the false impression I think people have is that, well, when you're dealing in the visual arts or when you're dealing in the plastic arts, you're actually dealing with material. Music, that's this sort of ephemeral, utterly immaterial. That's not true. But how do you understand the nature of composition? Does self-expression help there? Is there another model that accounts for the phenomenon of musical composition?
This is a great question, and I wish that I had a great answer. Sound, why does sound mean anything? I'm not really quite sure, but God somehow made it to mean something. And I think we were talking about Duchamp a little bit earlier, John. Sorry. And then, of course, Cage is the comparison there in the music world, who is saying, hey, listen to the sounds around you because there is music all around you. And interpreting it as music as opposed to just interpreting it as something mundane. But why does sound have the power that it does? I think that is really, I keep coming back to it as a mystery. We could always, of course, say that the sound of your mother's voice has a certain timbre to it, and so maybe the sound of the strings in the orchestra, the guts, the sheep guts going, I love that. That's great. Going back to that has some sort of a soft sound that we can relate to some other sort of sound. But I think that's why people are so fascinated with music. It's not an object in front of you. It's not something you can gaze at. And you can't ponder it for any length of time because it's gone. The second you hear it, it's already past you. So it has its limitations there.
What does musical invention look like for you? Do you, are you walking along and hear a sound that it triggers something, or what does it look like?
Oh, it can be that. It can be sounds from nature. You want to be careful about disclosing where you get your materials from because sometimes people will think less of you because of that. But I've been inspired by frogs.
High School Musical, right? High School Musical.
Yes. Yes, exactly. But I like what Jack Redford was talking about with Trevor just the other day, and some of you perhaps were there, talking about standing on the shoulders of everybody who's gone before you, and this was just coming up. I think it was being implied a moment ago. That we are artists together. Somehow we're all linked together. I don't think it can be any one person who's an artist who is detached from the rest of humanity, whether present or past or even future. So God initiated it, and it's all we have our part. You were referencing Tolkien in the chapter that we read. And how the God figure there starts some kind of a musical setting, and then we all have our parts that we play within that. That resonates with me deeply as a musician.
I wonder what, Trevor, you've done a little bit of work with this. A number of people have done work with the metaphor of improvisation in invention, an artistic invention. I wonder if that's something that you all find purchase as poets, as composers, as painters, even maybe as preachers. Does improvisation, is that a useful metaphor? Does that get us down the road in thinking of even our making good in general, or particularly our artistry?
I mean, isn't it the way we live? That's to say, what do we do when we get up in the morning? We have certain routine, we have certain fixed points, we have certain aspirations, we have certain patterns perhaps that we seek to emulate. But we're constantly confronted with ever new situations. No situation quite like that has ever happened to us before, and sometimes the particularity is very extreme, sometimes it's quite slight and we don't really notice it's a radically new moment. But very often we are called, therefore, to work both with the familiar, the sort of prompt, here's your character, here's your basic, you want to do it in this frame of mind, now, do this in that mood. And very often that's how we work. We improvise into new situations where we seek to extrapolate a pattern which is rooted in who we have been, and not just who we have been, but in a character which is formed by practices, which has ideals, which is, in Christian terms, of course, seeking to grow up into the fullness of the stature of Christ. But we're confronted with situations that Christ never was. Unfortunately, we can't just flick back into the New Testament and find out what would Jesus do. I'm afraid it's not like that. More relevant is what would he have me do? And that means improvising. That means there's no script, there's a sort of basic stage, and there's stage props of some sort in our imagination. We know roughly who we're supposed to be, what character we're supposed to play, but we don't have a script. And so improvisation actually, at its high point, it's a jazz saxophonist, but it's actually what you and I do every day.
Yeah, none of our making is ex nihilo, whether it's art objects or poetry with words or music. You're not going to invent any new notes. But it's all improvisation in that sense. And to me, there's a sort of a freedom that gives me, sort of a way to relax. It's like, oh, okay. The same thing when we realize that it's not about me. It's like, oh, I can relax now. I started thinking right away about your comments, Robert, at the beginning, that what makes music good? If nobody's ever heard this piece, is it good or isn't it? Is it ticket sales, the number of people that show up to the concert? Was that a good conversation? There was only 2 people. What makes something good? It's not about me. It's not, oh, I can relax, it's not about me. I think that's a huge thing for us to realize, is that, I've been contemplating this, my life story is not about me. Oh, I can relax a little bit. I don't have to be the central character in my own life story. That is really cool. I can relax a little bit.
Amen and amen.
But I thought I'd just throw in there originality also. That dirty word that comes up can be petrifying to all of us. So, one of you, maybe it was Bill, just mentioned the notes on the piano. Does Beethoven have a copyright on the C major triad, for instance? There's only so many things you can do with that instrument over there, and so many keys that you can press, and every single one of those keys has been used by some composer at some point. And what are you going to do? It's simply limiting. But I also see this in Hollywood. You know how many stories are there for the different films? There's only a set number of stories that are available. And we seem to keep going back to Greece and to Rome and to retreading these same stories over and over and over in some way.
When you said Greece, I thought of John Travolta.
Not that Greece, yeah, not High School Musical, not Greece, but the originality, I think, comes down into how we tell the story. But there again, it's the same stories, I think, that are being told.
Yeah, so I take it though, as I take your point, Doug, I think it's a great point. I think you're right, Trevor, that's what we do in life, is we improvise, and there's a certain freedom in knowing that I'm not the main character. I'm called precisely to find my life in Christ. So there's a lot of liberation there. I still assume that it's possible to make good and to make bad, to improvise poorly. Now, there are lots of options, but it's certainly possible to improvise poorly. What's a poor improvisation? How do we know a poor improvisation?
I'm struck, and I can't speak to the musical element of this, so I should let someone else, but I'm struck by the importance of learning your scales for being able to improvise. And similarly, I'm very confident that Picasso knew the proportions of the human face before he began to sort of warp and alter in order to foster our perceptions of that. And I think both sort of in life, when, as Trevor mentioned, when we're called upon to improvise, that's a real moment of an opportunity for Christ-likeness and for making choices based out of character, which you hope that you've honed through maybe more expected circumstances to prepare you for the unexpected. But I think, you know, in writing, for instance, you want to sort of be familiar with meter, and you want to be familiar with your vocabulary, and you want to be familiar with the tools and the history that you have, so that when there's opportunity for inventiveness, which I think is one of the human elements that are very much in God's image, that you would be able to do that in a way that suits aspects of character that we hope are like Christ, and that you hope, you know, your practice is paid off, basically. Your scales will come to bear when you have an opportunity to do something new and inventive.
I remember my great relief when I found out that E.E. Cummings was educated. I'm so used to getting emails with no punctuation, no capital letters. It's a crass phenomena. And then to think, oh, someone who knew how to write capitals. I mean, that's yeah. But that fits you learn the scale. So you can trust someone who can do so much more, but is doing one particular thing, or doing something new from a place of having a wider set of options. That's nice.
This is why I like the model of improvisation for creativity much better than expression. I don't really care for expression as a model for doing art, because in expression the idea is to be authentic. The priority is to be authentic and, to a great extent, innocent and ignorant, right? That's the authentic expression. Otherwise, it's polluted with all sorts of social constructs and so on. Whereas, which is utterly individualistic. Whereas improvisation, good improvisation is the opposite. An innocent, authentic person trying to improvise in any field, athletics, basketball game, debate, music, kind of theatrical improvisation, and so on and so forth. Usually the innocent person is not a good improviser because they don't know what they're doing, they don't know the flow, they don't know the discipline, they haven't disciplined themselves. And so there's not really very much creativity that comes out of an innocent, ignorant person, generally. So improvisation pushes you into immersing oneself in tradition, in history, what has come before you, and forces you to be very attuned to what's going on around you. A good improviser, a good athlete, a good person in debate or so on, is very attuned to what's going on around them so that they can intervene in very fitting ways. And that's what strikes us as most fitting, most creative, I think, are people who are able to do the right thing at the right time.
Just a real quick pushback on that. The only thing I want to put, you dropped the word authenticity near the end there. What I want to say is that authenticity and relationality just aren't in a zero-sum game. So you can keep authenticity in improvisation. It's just not something that gets set over against being in relation and independence on others. That is, as I become more and more myself, I am clearly doing things that trade on what others have done, but I'm doing them in ways that are utterly fitting to who I am. So I don't think you have to lose authenticity even in improvisation.
Just going back to a musical analogy for a moment, and going back to what Amy said about rehearsal, practice, scales, all the rest. Another musical analogy which is slightly less threatening perhaps than improvisation, where this goes on for ages and you have to be absolutely brilliant to do it well. I'm thinking of the cadenza, which is, you're in the middle of a piece, you've got the whole piece shapes your sense of the music, and then everybody else pauses and you get this 20 measures or whatever it is, 20 bars of stuff, and you do improvise. It's an improvisation, and it has to be in accordance with the bigger piece. And I mean, how does that work in human communities? I think the word improvisation sums up ideas far too easily of just making it up as we go along, and of course it's anything but that. It's about expressing a character which is formed by habit, by practice, by belonging to a community. And your question was, Matt, how do we know when it's a bad improvisation? I'm not sure we necessarily ever know. I think it's others who can see whether it's a good improvisation or a bad one or a not quite so good one. Of course, I mean, going back to Doug's point, the great thing is in the Christian context, we can step out and improvise boldly and get it wrong and not be fearful of that. But nevertheless, sometimes we don't know when we've got it wrong. We need the church, we need the community of those who also share the same practices and who are in the same business as we are to reflect back to us that, that was great. I mean, that was really helpful, or try again, because sometimes, we mess up badly.
Well, in theatrical improvisation, one of the basic rules is you never block another. Yeah. And that strikes me as really helpful here too, because I take it that applied to the life of the church, not blocking doesn't mean not disapproving, but what it means is, so when you don't block someone in improvising, what you do is you take anything they do and find a way to incorporate it. And I take it that's what happens in the church, because the God of all mercy and grace knows how to incorporate anything we do. And in the church, we're able to ask and receive forgiveness. So if if Doug doesn't block me when I screw up my improvisation, when I say sin, it's not that he condones my sin, but he announces the reconciling forgiveness of God to me. He embraces me again as a brother, and therefore transforms my sin into the sort of thing that can actually make for life for me and for the community. So that even, and I love that, it's not a refusal to offer judgments, but it's the sort of thing that always bends things back towards the life of the community and the life of the individual.
I would just point out that it seems to me the best theological rationale for all that you're talking about here is really to understand it in terms of the wisdom tradition of Scripture, where God is clearly interested in the development of these patterns of traditions, of practice, and all the rest. There's a verse in Isaiah that says, "Does not the farmer sow in rows and reap in rows? Does not God teach him?" Well, God didn't teach him. It was probably his grandfather and his father that taught him, and yet God was interested in that. And the fact that Jesus is so commonly in his stories starts with these kinds of, man went out to sow, and they sowed in all these images of what in fact is the caring for the earth. And God clearly is interested in that. And this is, I think, a very important thing for us to remember.
Another thing I have in mind if we're talking about originality and expression versus improvisation is within the literary tradition, it's a newish phenomena to always originate your story. And even the model of just Greek tragedy, all of the poets were sort of competing to tell they wanted to get the authoritative version. They wanted to become the tradition. So, I mean, the Oedipus myth goes before and beyond them, but Sophocles one year won the tragic competition and became the poet of the Oedipus story. So there's a way in that sense, there's a vying for the attention of your public. It's a relationship to the polis for the Greeks. I mean, Shakespeare's a perfect model of that too. And Milton, even when you think, by the time you're in the 17th century, people are starting to definitely originate new narratives. But, Milton kind of told the human fall, and he takes material that's not his, primarily, not his origin, and he becomes the poet of the fall. So, if I were an artist, I'd find that image quite intimidating. I wouldn't want to be vying to become the authoritative poet of X, Y, or Z. But it definitely disrupts a sense of literature as self-expression, this sense of becoming a poet for a people, where you would be telling a shared story with maximal art and insight, and telling it the most compellingly, I suppose.
And if I understand jazz improvisation, which having never done it, I might not, but it seems that it's full of references. It's full of musical references to things that have been done, and play with those references in new ways. And I think in a line of poetry, for instance, all the time we talk about you desire something to be fitting. You desire an image or a metaphor, for instance, to be fitting and to be surprising. You want to feel, yes, that's so true. I wouldn't have thought of it. And that's what we like, the sort of human inventiveness that also has an appropriateness to what's come before, to what we understand. And I actually think, I personally don't know any artists of any seriousness or success who have ever articulated the motivation of self-expression. I think it's kind of a red herring that might draw someone toward the arts. I just have so many feelings, I just need to, but I genuinely think if you persist over any length of time with any amount of love, I personally don't know anyone who has that orientation, because you do become such a disciple of what's come before. You become so attentive to the material that you're working with, and you become so grateful and delighted by what you're able to make in this larger conversation.
And what is it about that actually mutes or dampens this sense of self-expression? So I could see, I don't know, would you say a little bit more there?
I certainly know, at least among writers, that you really desire to have a voice, and you desire to have your work overall to have characteristics that are coherent, because that makes for a more fitting, more understandable, more relatable whole. But I just think you become, of the artists I know, you become enamored of or obedient enough to the craft and to the masters that you're relating to, and your desire to actualize some idea in the world or to engage it. In my experience and in the experience of those who have sort of spoken to me from their own art, really it just has never been articulated in terms of self-expression for people who, because I think other things loom larger for you amid your craft, both sort of orienting yourself to what others are saying, attending to the material, and the striving to make something fitting and surprising, something new and appropriate to what's come before. It doesn't, in the end, at least to me, ever feel like self-expression, even though, as we've talked about, in one sense of expression, you do feel like you are, in a way, the medium as well. That, the idea of inspiration being inbreathed with something beyond yourself that you're able to maybe echo, image, mirror in some small, pale, particular way.
Can I just flip the whole thing? We only have a few more minutes for this conversation. I'm struck how much we're talking about, strike that. Here's the question. So the subtitle was of the symposium today is Creation, the Arts, and the Kingdom. And I think we've been implicitly talking about all the good that the arts hold for those who are citizens of the kingdom. Let me flip it. What does the kingdom give to art? I know it was abrupt.
I'm going to go back to what I was saying when I was up there at the podium. For me, anyway, it gives purpose. It gives meaning to the whole thing. And without the kingdom, this is something that's going to be a flash in the pan. It just doesn't have any sustenance, no soul to it.
And can you elaborate a little more? How does the kingdom give sustenance or staying power?
The word I'm thinking of is hope. Yeah, and without hope, I don't know that I personally could make art. I don't know that anybody could make art. Yeah, without hope.
I think I want to say something similar, but say it in this way. In this context of art as an improvisational activity, where you're trying to do something fitting in the moment and so forth. Within that situation, I feel like creation on the one hand, kingdom on the other. Creation, the cultural mandate feels like a push, something pushing from behind, so to speak, a trajectory that is coming from the past, that is the mandate to cultivate the earth, develop the givens. And I feel like the kingdom is sort of the pulling towards something into the future. It's the as we're improvising in the moment, it is the eschatological tug of hopefulness. Maybe it's not a very clear vision, but it is a vision that cultivating the earth today is in one way or another bound up with and pointing towards the hope for shalom in the future, a wholeness, the kingdom on earth. So I think it's this improvisational stuff, but it's shot through with this narrative of creation and kingdom.
I was just thinking of the way that Milton pictures Eden and the cultivation, the specific cultivation task that our first parents were gardeners, and his Eden, Milton's Eden, threatens to be too wild. It's so rich and full that it needs that plants need to be trained. So that suggests to me something like what you're saying, John, of the kingdom is the thing that creation would have. Let me start that over. I suppose what I was thinking of there is that Milton's Eden has the potential to go too wild, so that without cultivation, the earth looks less and less like the creation it's intended to be. So on the one hand, we can paint the positive picture of the kingdom giving a vision to the artist of what to move towards, and also I'm thinking of it in terms of there's also the kingdom is an invitation to not let the world look less and less like its orientation and intention.
Yeah, I like the idea that it provides the meta-narrative in which our storytelling can find this heroic connection to I love your eschatological, art is a process, not a product, and it's moving towards something, and the kingdom gives us this grander sense of towardness, the transcendence with a small t in poetry, bringing these two otherwise disparate images together so as to transcend both of them. Well, the kingdom gives us grand transcendence, toward which we can move. And what are we going to improvise with? Well, the kingdom gives us all these wonderful sets of resources to improvise with in whatever our art forms might be, literary or musical or visual.
I see too, in terms of what's given to us by the kingdom for creativity and creation, is as you mentioned, Matt, the sort of the dignity of the particular that's embodied most perfectly in the incarnation of Christ, that it gives us hope as makers that particular things have value, that the world has the capacity to be good in a way that reflects God's goodness, and also, as I think you mentioned very well, orients us to the larger transcendence toward which we aim, and in light of which we live. And so that balance of the particular and the whole are immensely helpful, at least for me, orienting in terms of value of your art and its aims.
I think if you think of the kingdom as both future prospect and present, albeit hidden, largely reality, it seems to me that what the kingdom gives to artists is both the sense of something towards which to work, but also it's the kingdom realities, I think, which the artist glimpses behind the surfaces of reality as we experience it. And it's that which keeps art going. It's that which the artist is working with. Thinking of George Steiner's repeated statement in his book, Real Presences, where he says, and Steiner, a secularized Jew, but I mean, very shaped by his Judaism, I think, and he says that, all art, and this is an argument against postmodernism for him, all art is predicated finally on a wager on transcendence. And by that, and finally he comes around and said, and of course that's a wager on God. And what he means by that, I think, is that actually, and this is true in wider life, not just in the arts, but supremely in the arts, you would only do what you do if you believed, despite the fact that you cannot necessarily demonstrate, that there is something out there true and good and meaningful which is worth engaging with. If that's just made up, if that's just a human construct, and anybody who believed it was, let alone an individual construct, would probably just pack up and go home. So he said artists have this sense, they're almost seers. I mean, they have a glimpse of something towards which they're working and with which they're working, and they believe it's real even when they can't demonstrate with certainty that it's real, because it's not obvious on the face of things. And I think, his image of a wager is a great one, but I think what the kingdom gives is a promise, not a wager.
That's great. Okay, let's thank all the panelists. You can all take your seats, and I think Trevor will have a few concluding remarks for us.
I have to be honest here and admit that until 40 minutes ago, I'd completely forgotten I was supposed to do this, so I'm not sure having the last word is necessarily a great thing. So this is rather ex nihilo, which I guess is appropriate. if you saw me scribbling up there for the first 10 minutes, you now know why I was scribbling, because I don't, on the whole, function well without anything on paper, even though when I've got something which is completely incoherent on paper. The title, Making Good, which Matt used as a sort of overview title for this session, is actually, and here's a shameless plug, the title for my next book, although the subtitle of that is Creation, Creativity, and Artistry. And in that, really, one of the things I'm wanting to explore is precisely, to pick up on where we've been this afternoon, the analogy with divine making that we've already heard about, of God as an artist who joyfully and out of love, rather than, as it were, through gritting his teeth through hard labor, calls the world into being and sits back at each stage and enjoys the goodness of what he's made. And there has to be an analogy there with human artistry. But it's more than just an analogy, and this is where the argument of the book is going, that the analogy is interesting, but it's more than just an analogy, that actually human creativity, artistic creativity and other sorts, is actually more of a sharing in God's continuing divine making and remaking of the world, and bringing it to a completion and a fullness which it doesn't as yet manifest. So I really liked some of the things that were said earlier on, and I found them enormously helpful, let me say. I've scribbled a lot of them down, so going back to the idea of standing on the shoulders of others and there being no originality, I now provide a sort of admission that there'll be horrible plagiarism from this session. And I have to go back and rewrite the final section of the book. I like the idea, I love that phrase of Amy's that, that art presages the way the world may or will yet be and become, that it gives glimpses, foretastes. We're not there, but art gives us a glimpse. Something to hold on to, something to thoroughly enjoy in the here and now. I tend to avoid the word beauty when I'm dealing with the arts, because as soon as you raise the term beauty, there are 55 different people saying, but what do you mean by beauty? And of course there are 55 and more different ways of answering that question. But one way in which I've sometimes made sense of it is precisely in this way, that if we think of beauty not so much as a property of things, which it may or may not be, I don't want to get into that argument, but as a response we have to certain things, and sometimes very different things. Okay, not always things that we would judge as visually pretty or attractive. And in a Christian theology of beauty, of course, we do have to deal with the fact that right at the heart of the story we tell, the vision that we sketch for people, is not something attractive. It's the ugliness of the cross, which yet, in some sense, is possessed of a beauty. Whatever that is, whatever we say about in making sense of it. That response is drawn forth from us because what we're engaging with in whatever number of different examples, all of which may look very different, what we're dealing with are little glimpses, presages, anticipations, going back to a Marilyn Robinson phrase, of home, of where we're called to be finally, of a world which will be fulfilled and perfected and completed at God's hands, but not without our hands being involved. And so that's the thesis of artistry, creativity as a sharing in bringing the world more fully to be what it's called to be in God's purposes for it. So too I liked what John was saying about art as bound up in ethics and eschatology. I mean, that's exactly the point. Art is hopeful. That ties in too with the Steiner point that actually it has to be hopeful, it has to be optimistic, it has to be sure that there's something worth engaging with here, something beyond ourselves, that it's not all just a human construct of meaning ready to die when we do. Earlier in the week I've been talking about artistry not just as a phenomenon, or a set of phenomena, but as a paradigm case, or as Rowan Williams puts it, an urgent case of the way we engage more broadly as human beings with a given world which we are yet called to make more of, or to make something of, rather than just to consume it or to sit back and enjoy it. Actually to get our hands dirty, as God got his hands dirty in creating the world, and to do something with it, to make more of it than we receive from it. And I think that's fairly obvious that we do that if we think of the importance of culture or ethos in the way we dwell in the human world. I mean, the world isn't simply a physical phenomenon, it's imbued with meaning, but meaning's a uniquely human sort of a thing. significance, values. All of those are shot through our humanity. And we're involved in unfolding and unpacking and making those as well as discovering them. So I was thinking of Melissa's point about connections in metaphor. In a sense, we don't make those. They're there for us. Well, that's true, vitally true in one sense, but in another sense, of course, we do. We do at the level of language. We make metaphors. No one's ever used language that way before. And furthermore, in using it, we enable other people to see the world or to experience the world quite differently. So the connections may have been out there somewhere, but in discovering them, we're also being creative in our uses of language and the ways we reflect that world, and then change the way people indwell it and experience it from then on. And the power of metaphor to reshape the world for us and to enable us to experience and indwell it differently. Doug mentioned C.S. Lewis, and I'll finish with this. Lewis, I was talking about last week at Wheaton, and his conviction that his responsibility as a scholar, and he was a scholar of medieval and Renaissance literature, wasn't to make objective judgments about it from a 20th century perspective, or to weigh it in the balance and compare it with 19th century literature or anything else. It was to put his students in a place where they saw the world through medieval poetic eyes, insofar as that was possible. His job was to translate them from the 1950s or the 1940s into the 14th century and help them to see the world as Dante saw it. And if he'd done something of that, then he'd done his job and done it to the best of his ability. And his students bore fairly rich witness that this was exactly what he did. Kenneth Tynan, the theatre director, who was one of Lewis's last undergraduates, said, you know, if you'd spent 3 sessions in a classroom with C.S. Lewis, you felt as if you were Dante. You felt as if you'd been inside Dante's head. Now, of course, that's, you know, qualifications fly in the door at that point. Of course, no one can be put inside Dante's head, but Lewis did it as well as anyone could do it. And he generated this capacity to put people in, to enable people to see the world differently than they normally saw it. And of course, that's exactly what Lewis did as a Christian too. His great apologetic writings aren't masterpieces of philosophical argument, although they contain plenty of philosophical argument and perfectly good philosophical argument. Where they really succeed, where they really are outstanding, is in their capacity to help people to see what the world looks like as a Christian, what it feels like as a Christian. And he did that incredibly well, just as he did the other task incredibly well. So going back to the idea of imagination, the poetic artistry, the way in which we take something and we reshape it, and in doing so we help other people to see the world differently. Well, isn't that what we're called to do as Christians? We'll just leave it there, I think.
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.